Thanks for being here. Czech Republic?
Czech Republic, nice. Germany. Awesome.
Yo.
What's up, everybody? Bay
What's
Area
up, guys?
represent. What's up?
What's going on? Sega.
The Yay
Sega.
area is what's up.
Guys, what's going on? Everybody good?
Hello from LA.
Pumped.
SoCal's. Sorry.
Pumped. Pennsylvania. Garrett, where in Pennsylvania, man? The chess seminar. I'm sorry. You're going to be severely disappointed.
You don't play chess?
I mean, I could probably beat you at that because I beat you at pretty much everything. But, you know.
Except for, like, bench press.
Is that a challenge? That's true. That's true. I mean, remember, there is one person on here needs to read your dissertation and approve it. So I'd be real careful.
The cool thing about AUT
you beat Eric handily for onset of alopecia. So that's cool.
Burn.
Things are being said. Wow. I mean, I don't know. Eric's in his mid-30s now, so we'll cut him a break because he could, have early onset Alzheimer's after tonight.
I don't remember what you said about whatever you said earlier. So,
Greg, did your parents sign the permission slip for you to be here? Are you old enough?
I think so. I hope so.
Toronto,
Sydney, Australia.
Canada.
Hold on, everybody. Marty, you're about to do cardio? Marty, come on. This is upsetting. Do you want to be a small, weak person or a big, strong person? I was hoping that.
You got to pitch him on being big and strong first.
That's why they're here tonight.
Yeah.
Hopefully I can win. Hopefully I can win that battle.
Currently only taking in 0.1 grams per kg of protein and doing cardio all the time. Is this? I don't know. I need to be convinced.
I was just going to talk about marathon training tonight. That's pretty good at that.
Yeah, you guys don't know.
He actually did.
Mike is actually a very accomplished marathon runner. So
it's true.
Yeah. 5 of them. If you ever want to learn about being extraordinarily mediocre to terrible at something, I can talk about that for a while.
Extraordinarily mediocre. I don't know if you can.
It's like an extra medium T-shirt. I live in South Florida. There's an extra medium T-shirt shop on every corner.
All right, guys, let's get rolling and do this. Welcome everyone to this free webinar for MASS Monthly Application in Strength Sport. I'm Greg Knuckles. If you don't know, my co-hosts here are Eric Helms and Mike Zordos, who are bringing you fantastic information, and I mostly just try to keep up with them. Just to give you an idea of how this is going to run, we each recorded a lecture, strung back to back. They're about 90 minutes long, so pretty succinct. We'll be here the whole time answering questions in the chat. Try to keep them germane to the topics of the talk going on. And then if you have questions that are either really long, where we probably couldn't reasonably type out a response, or something that's either about the product itself or about a training topic, unrelated to the topics of our presentation, we will stick around for a live Q&A afterwards. So after the last presentation is done, don't go anywhere. We're still going to be here answering questions. And also, the cart to buy MASS is opening up as soon as the presentation starts. So if you already know that you want it, you can be one of the first people who gets it. So that's pretty awesome. And so now let's introduce the presentations, and I believe Eric's is first.
Yeah, what's going on? My name's Eric Helms. If you're not familiar, I lift heavy things and I like the science about it, and moderately heavy things compared to Greg, pretty light. And I may or may not be wearing pants today, so that's something you can ask yourself throughout the presentation. Don't worry about it if I am or not. But one thing I did want to say is that it's really difficult to pay attention to content that you're watching if you're asking a bunch of questions. So I would err on the side of paying more attention, taking notes. And of course, if there is something you need clarification on, feel free to ask. So I'll be talking about, which I'll introduce in the pre-recorded video, nonlinear dieting and things like refeeds, calorie and carb cycling, diet breaks, which there is not a whole lot of research on, but the research that is out there is actually interesting, and it's kind of disconnected, and we're going to try to make you aware of what there is. So, yeah, that's me. Mike?
Hey guys, for those that don't know me, my name is Mike Zordos, and I'm an assistant professor at Florida Atlantic University and focus in skeletal muscle physiology, strength and conditioning, program design, periodization, and those sorts of things. Honored to be here with these guys tonight. Just a few things I saw in the comments. There's a question from Demetrius if I have a Greek name. I do. Christos Anesti, my friend. I saw a couple people asking Eric to take his shirt off. Be real careful because he does like to have pickup bodybuilding games. Some people have pickup basketball games, but Eric does that. Also, I saw somebody ask if this would be recorded. There will be a link available for 24 hours. So 24 hours, this will be live afterwards. Other than that, tonight, my video will focus on the 4 ways to implement autoregulation into your training. There's been a lot of research out recently in autoregulation, a lot of it by Eric and myself, but also some fantastic researchers. So we'll talk about how to use autoregulation and incorporate inside that into a periodized program on my part of this tonight. Hope that you watch that, and hope you stick around. We'll answer any and all questions after the 90 minutes of consecutive video. Greg, my friend.
And my video is going to cover the relationship between training intensity and hypertrophy. Basically, just taking you on a whirlwind tour of the last 18 years of research, because there's a ton of really interesting work out there. What, Eric?
A whirlwind tour. It's
whirlwind tour.
Best description for studies from the 90s.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, there's a ton of really cool stuff out there that a lot of people aren't aware of. And it's a topic I know I've written about before, but I haven't actually looked at, or I haven't written about each study in depth. So I think that will be good for adding a layer of context and depth to the discussion if that's something that interests you. And if it doesn't, how heavy should I lift to get jacked? If that doesn't interest you, why are you even here? So yeah, with that out of the way, the video will start in about 10 seconds or so. So stick tight.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to our webinar for the MASS launch. Let me just say that I'm really excited about starting MASS with Greg and Mike. Really glad you're here. And as you know, the theme of this webinar is basically research you might have missed, whether it's cutting edge stuff that might have some useful applications that you weren't aware of, that wasn't kind of in the mainstream circulation of research, or whether it was something more digging in the crates that was a niche or a little pocket of research that just hasn't seen the light of day. This is going to be a bit of a blend of both, but mostly stuff that people just haven't really put together or thought about its applications. And we're going to be talking about what do we really know about nonlinear dieting. In the evidence-based quote-unquote community, it's really common to see people using refeeds, diet breaks, or nutritional periodization, or some approach where it's not just a daily caloric restriction on a day-to-day throughout. In the research, that's the common way that dieting is researched, where you'll institute a calorie deficit, and it'll be the same throughout the course of the study. And if you want to actually think about what is the evidence basis of having a nonlinear diet, or having a variation in the days or the meals or the weeks in which you have a high or low calorie intake, you kind of have to dig around in the research, and most of the research is disconnected. So what we're going to try to do today is create some connections and give you some practical takeaways and familiarize you with the relevant research for taking a nonlinear approach to dieting. So without further ado, let's get into it. So like I said, it's commonly used, it's promoted, and it's been promoted for a while, the use of nonlinear approaches to dieting. I remember the first time I was exposed to it, I believe I was getting my ISSA certified personal trainer credential back in, I want to say, 2005, about 12 years ago. And I was exposed to Fred Hatfield's The Zigzag Diet, where basically you alternate periods of dieting and then going back to maintenance or slight surplus to build muscle and lose fat so that you can prevent the loss of muscle mass, and also they talked about the loss of energy expenditure or slowing down of metabolic rate. But there's been other forms. It's very common to see bodybuilders do carb cycling, where they have low, moderate, high, very high kind of in the cyclical fashion carb intake and therefore, calorie intake. As they add more carbs, calories go up as well. So the cyclical carbohydrate and calorie cycling approach is very common in bodybuilding, probably more common in the 90s and 2000s, but you still see it today. Another really popular approach to nonlinear diet would be the Ultimate Diet 2.0, kind of Lyle McDonald's, one of his earlier books that you may have heard of, where basically you have 5 borderline ketogenic low days, and then some refeeding over the weekend, and you combine, depletion workouts with strength workouts to try to kind of get the best of both worlds of the, muscle retention of a surplus and then the fat loss of a deficit. And similar approach would be what's called a CKD, or a cyclical ketogenic diet, where you're on low carbohydrates and low calories, and then you do cyclical refeeds, or even targeted ketogenic diets, where you put your carbs on workout days around your workouts to try to basically get the best of quote-unquote nutrient partitioning. And probably the most common that I've seen is the use of refeeds, which are sometimes called cheat days, or the refeed is instituted by one meal being a cheat meal. Obviously, I think cheat days and cheat meals have a negative connotation that implies that the diet is too restrictive to follow and you have to cheat on it. But nonetheless, whether you're using a prescribed amount of calories and carbohydrates in the form of a refeed, or just a, hey, eat whatever the hell you want this day or on this meal, that's a very common approach to dieting, especially in kind of the fitness and bodybuilding community. But what data exists on this? Despite this being a very common approach in the evidence-based community, I would say that the knowledge of the underlying research, which might or might not support these approaches, is typically a little under par, in my opinion. So we're going to try, at least for those watching, fix that and make you aware of what data we do have. So first, let's talk about refeeds. First, we're going to talk about what we do know, then we'll talk about what we don't know, because I think that's probably more interesting in my opinion. So first, what we do know is that the typical approach to refeeds, where once or twice a week you take your calories up to maintenance, primarily through carbohydrate or slightly above that, really hasn't been researched. That principle makes sense because we do know that carbohydrate refeeding does increase leptin, which is basically our sensor that tells us how full we are and whether or not we're in a dieted state. And that has a downstream effect on metabolic rate, hunger, and satiation. So that's very important. Leptin has been some called the master hormone of dieting. But anyway, there's a study by, I'm probably going to mispronounce this, Derlewanger and colleagues from 2000, where they basically had a 3-day period where they took measurements on the 3rd day of being at a 40% surplus, so 140% of their total daily energy intake. And it is a carb-dominant refeed, so about 65% of the calories from carbohydrates, if I remember correctly. And there was a very meager increase in total energy expenditure, only about 7%. So I think in that study it amounted to about 130 calories. 30 of those calories were just the cost of metabolizing more foods, and but basically they were eating 600 more calories to get a 100 calorie increase. So the math doesn't really make sense as far as acutely helping you, right? There was a decent increase in leptin though, about 25%. Whether that had downstream effects, we don't know. This wasn't a long-term study, but we do know that. And again, this is a 3-day refeed, not a 24-hour refeed. Now, from a different angle, more the psychological side of it, there's a recent study by Coelho et al. Where they had a computer-based survey asking people about different approaches to dieting. And they compared 7 days at 1,500 calories to 6 days at 1,300 calories with 1 day at 2,700 calories. So basically a 1-day refeed roughly at maintenance. And people overall significantly preferred the 6 days with the 1 high day approach. And kind of makes sense when you think about it. 1,300 or 1,500 calories, both are really low. They both would kind of suck. But getting that one kind of light at the end of the tunnel might be more preferable. And these are equal amount of calories, by the way, at the end of the week. In both cases, it's about, I think, 10,500 by the end of the week. So similar amount of total weekly calories, but maybe you can enhance adherence or at least cater to someone's preferences by using a refeed approach, which is interesting to know. Also, something we've known for a long time is about glycogen replenishment.
And this is through a lot of the carb loading studies on endurance athletes. We know that you can replenish glycogen and get it quote unquote super compensated to like maximal glycogen levels full of carbohydrates in the muscle with a 24-hour high carbohydrate refeed. The study I'm thinking of specifically where glycogen reached maximum levels and didn't increase after the first day was with 10 grams per kilogram. And so that's a lot of carbohydrates. So certainly we know that certain sports are influenced by the performance in certain sports are improved if you have high levels of muscle glycogen. And certainly in bodybuilding, anecdotally, we see that when someone is fuller with glycogen, they look bigger, and it stretches their skin a little more, and they look leaner, and they look fuller, and they just have a better overall aesthetic look, which can potentially improve performance in bodybuilding. So that's something worthwhile, that it could potentially improve performance and adherence, and there may be a utility in refeeds for that reason. Now, probably even more importantly than all that, in my opinion, are a couple of studies that look at what's called LH pulsatility. So that's luteinizing hormone, and these are studies in women. And basically, changes in LH tell you whether or not someone is starting to have menstrual cycle irregularities, whether they're heading towards losing their menstrual cycle or amenorrhea. And this is a cool study because basically what happened was they had a aggressive calorie restrict period followed by a 24-hour refeed where they're eating a lot of food. We're talking normal sized women, I believe, eating over 4,000 calories. So that's a lot of food for someone that size. And interestingly enough, thyroid levels and LH did not get fully restored, and no matter the fact that they ate that much in a 24-hour period. However, in another study a few years prior by Olson and colleagues, they had a similar amount of calorie restriction, but followed by 2 days just eating at maintenance. They just returned to their normal food patterns, basically. And they saw that by the second day, thyroid had come back to normal, and so had LH pulsatility. So this shows that there's not only a total amount of food that matters, but also the time period, which makes sense from kind of like an evolutionary perspective. If you were in the middle of a period of starvation, say an ice age, and you couldn't get access to food, and you're a caveman, you run across an animal, you kill it, you eat it, but there's no more food. Obviously, you wouldn't want the adaptation of then your metabolism coming right back up, and then burning a lot of calories, and then you starve to death faster. You would think it would make more sense for there to be the signal associated with there being an abundance of food for a longer sustainable period before your metabolism starts to be burning more calories, et cetera. And you're, more importantly, ready to have children who are going to consume more food and require more calories from you as a pregnant woman, right? So it seems to be there's not only a magnitude of food, but a time component of food consumption that affects the hormonal status and the thyroid balance, if you will, in response to feeding. So that's what we know. Now, what do we not know? Actually, a fair bit, because like I said, the use of 1 or 2 refeeds per week in the course of like a bodybuilding diet is not something we've studied. It'd be great if we had, but we simply don't know how that affects kind of from an applied sense. Like looking back on 2 groups of bodybuilders doing a 24-week diet, one doing weekly refeeds, the other one just straight calorie deficit the whole time. We don't know how that would change the outcomes. It's possible that it can impact energy expenditure in the long term, maybe impacting NEAT, or non-exercise activity thermogenesis, basically keeping you less sedentary, preventing the decreases in spontaneous physical activity, somehow impacting total energy expenditure in that manner. We're not sure if it could improve muscle retention. There's certainly a rationale for that. We know that overfeeding increases insulin, so that would potentially decrease muscle protein breakdown. We also know that could potentially improve performance depending on how it's related to when you're training. So refeeds could potentially, help you retain muscle through those mechanisms. But this is something we don't know, and we can't know until we really have some good long-term research using the type of refeed schedules we see in practice. An extension of refeeds is something called a diet break, and you probably saw the theme of those refeeds that were more effective. They lasted longer than a day. And essentially, diet breaks are just kind of continuing that so that they last a week or 2 weeks longer, or even longer, maybe 3 weeks. So diet breaks, though, essentially, we don't have a whole lot of research on them. In fact, there's really only one study where they instituted this directly, and it primarily looked at the kind of applied outcome of weight loss. It's a pretty cool study, though. Wing et al. Said, you know what, we need to look at the actual breaks in diets, not the diets themselves, because everyone is effective at losing weight. It's just that they can't maintain weight loss. So we need to actually look at what happens when people break their diet. So they effectively disprove their own hypothesis. They thought that by instituting a break of 2 weeks throughout the diet, that it would interfere with people's ability to lose weight. Interestingly enough, the group that took these breaks, they didn't actually disrupt their weight loss efforts. They lost as much weight as the group that didn't. So what's really interesting about that is just that they ate probably more total calories, yet somehow they didn't lose as much weight, or they lost just as much weight. So the question is why? Well, potentially it's related to adherence. Just simply they actually did eat less total calories because when they were truly on the diet, they did better. Or it could be something physiological. Perhaps that those small effects on metabolic rate that we see from a refeed are enhanced when you spend 2 weeks at maintenance calories. But there's still many questions left to be answered. How does it impact long-term adherence? You would think that if someone had a lot of weight to lose, that being able to take these breaks would be effective. And really, the reason diet breaks seem to be effective comes down to that the way the diet breaks were instituted in this study are very different from the way that breaking of the diet happen. Typically, people diet and diet and diet, burn themselves out, and then they just go on a binge fest and they break down and they really undo a lot of the work they've done. In this study, though, it was a planned, structured period of eating and maintenance, and it didn't happen when they were out of willpower or totally sick of the diet. It happened under their control. So that's something we can use to our advantage. If we know that they don't disrupt weight loss efforts, perhaps we can get the benefits of a refeed, but magnified, and improve adherence. And I think these are probably one of the more effective potential tools out there. And just like refeed, there is a potential they could help with muscle retention, given it's even more time out of a deficit. And same thing for performance. So yeah, diet breaks, basically similar concept to refeeds, rather just longer time period. Now, finally, let's talk about carb cycling. Again, very little research done in the way that this is done in practice. In fact, all the research out there is done on either what's called a 5 and 2 diet or every other day fasting. And it's done mostly obese people. Now, when you hear 5 and 2, you're probably thinking, okay, that's 5 days dieting and then 2-day refeed. Maybe great, I have the weekend to eat whatever I want. It's actually the opposite. In the research, there's a fair bit of research on 2 days per week being nearly at a completely fasted level of calories, so eating nothing, or very low level calories, like 550 grams of protein, that type of thing. And similar approach with the every other day fasting. It's very low calories on the days when you are not eating in maintenance. And these are all compared to calorie matched daily calorie restriction diets. Not always, but that's the research we're going to be looking at. And again, it's mostly in obese. And there are differential effects of a calorie deficit on someone who's lean or someone who has a lot of body fat. So the first piece of research we're going to look at is a review by Verity from 2011. And this was a pretty cool review in that its findings showed that there was equal fat loss in the daily calorie restriction groups with the intermittent calorie restriction groups, but there was a greater fat-free mass retention. Now, with that said, this is a review of a small number of studies. The studies typically had a low sample size and not always the best methods for assessing body composition change, but it's still very telling. It's hypothesis generating for sure, at the least, But there was also a recent review that came out this year by Harvey and Howell, where they had probably stricter criteria for what was included, a more complete review, in my opinion. And when more data is out, because it came out 6 years later, you can be a little more picky and choosy and have tighter inclusion criteria. And they found probably less exciting findings, but still interesting findings. Overall, they found that there's at least equal fat loss between the intermittent calorie restriction approaches, that's the 5 and 2 or the every other day fasting approaches, compared to daily calorie restriction. I believe all but one study showed a non-significant difference between the two types of diet, and one showed greater fat loss. That was a 2013 study by Harvey in the group that was doing the intermittent approach. Similar findings as far as the metabolic effects, largely looking at improving insulin resistance, but there was more studies that favored the intermittent approach. There was a couple that showed that an intermittent approach might have had better metabolic and health effects in terms of like blood markers for insulin resistance compared to daily calorie restriction. And overall, though, there was not enough high-quality data to assess other variables like adherence or fat-free mass retention. But overall, looking at these two reviews, there's certainly something intriguing about them, and it may be that they could provide an advantage at least to some people. Now, with that said, they did take the time to point out that complete fasting or very low kcal fasting is not well tolerated in lean people. And this makes sense. When you have a whole lot of body fat to play with, when you're in a deficit, you can replace that with body fat. But when you are very lean, that's going to result in lean body mass losses, which can exacerbate decrements in metabolic rate. It can increase hunger, and largely it's just not as easy to adhere when you have really, really low calories. So for what that means for lean people, if you want to take a shot at this, it means that maybe you should have something more along the lines of 3 days at a calorie surplus level, and then 4 diet days that are low, but not crazy low, like 500 calories or a complete day of fasting. So obviously this would probably need to be modified to be used in a practical sense, but may still give some of these benefits. So overall, let's kind of sum it all up and talk about what we can take away from this kind of pocket of research that hopefully you're now aware of. First, we know that studies representing current practice of using 1 to 2 refeeds a week simply don't exist. Okay, but we do know some principles, and the big one is that overfeeding has not only an energy component, like how many calories did you eat, but also a time component, and that simply refeeding for a single day at maintenance calories or even above that is probably not going to have more effects than simply improving glycogen levels, potentially having a day where your training goes really well, and maybe even the next day as well. So it can potentially help you maintain muscle. It's certainly a mental break. But some of the metabolic or hormonal effects that we talked about in the Lukes and Olson studies are probably going to require more than a 24-hour period of refeeding. So we know that with 1 day, probably going to have a minimal impact on hormonal and metabolic status, even if you eat a whole lot. So that means that likely if you're going to be refeeding, you need at least 2 days. That 48-hour period is probably what's going to require getting those kind of benefits. And I've seen anecdotally a lot of success using 48-hour refeeds with my clients, and that's prevented amenorrhea, or at least delayed amenorrhea in some of my female clients compared to previous preps. We also know that a 2-week diet break doesn't disrupt weight loss, which is fantastic. That means we can take breaks regularly and do a lot to kind of regain some lost muscle tissue, regain some lost motivation, regain some lost performance, and really just kind of get our head above water before we dive back down. And we also know that intermittent energy restriction approaches are at least effective as daily caloric restriction, and potentially more effective. Probably this applies more so to obese people, but really we don't have enough data on lean people. And ideally we need more research kind of that mirror the approaches that are taken in the field. I will often have 1 48-hour refeed per week and then 1 other day where I eat at maintenance, and that's kind of me mimicking what I think might be best practice for my clients who are lean, mimicking kind of that intermittent energy restriction approach where they have 4 dieting days and then 3 high days, if you will. So it probably requires modification, but we know there is certainly something going on because of that time and energy component to refeeding, and the fact that we're not just here to lose weight, we're here to lose fat, and we're here to maintain muscle mass and also do it in a sustainable way so we can get to our goals, and even long-term big picture not get burned out by a sport if it involves dieting a lot. So yeah, we need more research, but there is certainly some interesting approaches that can be taken, and hopefully that's helpful and you've learned a lot. And thank you for coming to our webinar. And as a last note before I finish up, be wary if you have clients or if you yourself have struggled with eating disorders, because this is actually an important note. I almost ended our webinar way too early. If you are someone who has struggled with binge eating especially, or if you find that refeeds turn into kind of these train wrecks, I would be wary of refeeds or these kind of in and out of a deficit approaches, because sometimes that can exacerbate that. And it's important. I would say, I want to point out again, like I said in the beginning, a cheat day is a little different than a refeed in terms of your mentality. And then when a refeed happens, it should be a planned and structured day, just like your deficit days, especially in those who struggle with disordered eating. Normally, it's when you take the structure away that can really kind of go off the rails. So it's important to keep structure around your diet, even if you are using a nonlinear approach. And with that, I will end it. Thank you for your time, and I will talk to you later.
Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar for MASS. We really hope that you enjoyed the first issue, which was our free issue in April. Now today starts our pre-launch, so we want to have a webinar here and give you just a little bit more of a taste of what you're going to see in MASS. We're going to keep this video to about 20 minutes, so let's get right to it. Now, what you may have missed, as the title of our webinar is, if you weren't paying attention to the scientific literature recently, is there are 4 ways that have been established to implement autoregulation into your training. So as you can see, that's the title of our talk. But the subtitle is Conceptualize and Integrate. If you've seen me talk before, or you've been in MASS before, and you're going to be here hopefully in the future, you would have heard me say these 2 words a lot. So what I want to get across today is not only the 4 ways you can implement autoregulation, but how if we understand these from a conceptual perspective, we will then understand how they're actually not mutually exclusive concepts, and we can integrate them into the same program. Let's get right to it. So our objectives for today, and as you're around in MASS, you'll see an objective slideshow or presentation here at each one at the beginning of my slideshows. The reason being, I want to get us across, get the point across of what we're going to cover in every presentation that we do, so we know what to expect. So understand the 4 ways to utilize autoregulation. That'll be one of our objectives. To examine how to integrate, as we just said, the various ways or types of autoregulation into the same program. Understand how autoregulation should fit within a periodized program. Autoregulation in and of itself isn't a standalone strategy. It fits within that periodized construct. Understand the positives and negatives of each of the 4 ways of autoregulation. And then because there are positives and negatives, we'll discuss briefly about what time certain things should be used or certain types should be used, and then what time other types should be used. So the 4 ways, we'll get right into it. Number 1, to assign or adjust training load intra-session, right? And we're going to break down each of these and how to do those. 2, to progress load from week to week. 3, to choose a daily training strategy. And then 4, to auto-regulate session volume. Now, as we said at the outset, autoregulation is not a standalone strategy. Rather, it's a way to do all of these things within a periodized construct. So remember to conceptualize and integrate. So these 4 things, right? To assign or adjust load, to progress load, to choose the daily training strategy, which is a flexible template, and to auto-regulate session volume. Let's start with number 1 and number 2. Now together, let's take both of these. So number 1 right here, to assign and adjust intra-session training load. What's the tool that we utilize to do that? Well, that's RPE, or rating of perceived exertion. And 2, to progress weekly training load. What's a tool we can use to do that? APRE, or autoregulatory progressive resistance exercise. Let's talk about these 2 together as we look at some figures and tables now. Okay, so as we get into that, we mentioned RPE, rating of perceived exertion. Well, I'm sure that we're all familiar with this, at least to an extent. So to assign or adjust intra-session training load, we're going to use this scale. So RPE on the left, our rating, so a 10 RPE equals maximum effort. If you record a 9 RPE, that means you feel like you could have done 1 more repetition at the completion of a set. If you record an 8 RPE, you feel like you could do 2 more repetitions at the completion of a set. That's pretty straightforward, and we're all familiar with that. But let's dive into it a little bit more. So before we look at this, remember our 2 things we're discussing here. To assign or adjust intra-session training load, and then 2, to progress load. So the first thing I want to establish when we look at this training block, and we're not going to dive into all of this because this is only a 20-minute video, and we're going to get into this in MASS quite a bit. But this block shows us, right, a lot of integrated periodization strategies. This is a periodized and program block with a lot of things in play, but that's outside of our scope for today. So let's just take this in terms of assigning and adjusting load prescription for now. So if we look at this, we just take week 1 and we take this row across. So we have this individual training 3 days per week, and then we can see 4 sets of 8 at 70%. Let's just take this on Monday, right? Or day 1 of the week. Well, we could do what? What's our first way to utilize autoregulation? Just completely abolish this 70%. We don't need it, right? And if we flip to the next slide, we can see 4 sets of 8 at 5 to 7 RPE. We could just say we want to train between a 5 to a 7 RPE today, right? And if we do that, we can just say for our first set of 8, we're just going to select the load, and let's say we have a max of 225 kilos on the squat. We might pick a load of about 165 kilos, that's 363 pounds, and say this is going to land us after 8 reps at around a 6 or a 7 RPE, and that would put us in that range. So that's a way to just assign load, right? But another way is to adjust load. So let's say we establish an RPE goal at the beginning of this block, and that RPE goal is 5 to 8, right? Meaning we're in a volume type block, so in our periodized construct, we're going to be early on in the macro cycle where volume is high and intensity is low. The higher volume is, the lower the RPE should be. So not only percentage of 1RM should be lower, but the RPE goal should be lower. So let's say it's 5 to 8 because getting volume is predicated on being able to do repeated efforts. So we do this and we have 70%, but let's say that we're not feeling great that day. So our first set gives us an RPE of 7. Our second set gives us an RPE of 8. Well, we're not going to be able to complete the next 2 sets of 8 within that RPE range if we're already at an 8, right, or a 9. So what we might do is then decrease the load, let's say 5 kilos or 7.5 kilos, to stay within that range of a 5 to 8 RPE. So within that, we take RPE 2 ways right now. 1, to just assign the load right off the bat, but 2, to use it in conjunction with percentage of 1RM. And this is something that I like to do a lot. The reason being, if we just give somebody an RPE target and they're not real good at it, they might overshoot that target. If we say we just want you to work up to 8 repetitions at, let's say, a 7 or an 8 RPE, they might overshoot that and fail or record a 10 RPE on the first set. And then their training session is really in trouble, and they've also created a lot of damage because now they've trained to failure and a lot of fatigue. So we can avoid that by using percentage of 1RM and RPE together. So if somebody can do 70% for, let's say, 12 to 15 reps, even if they're not feeling good, and you prescribe it for 8s, they're still going to likely be able to complete 8 on the first set, but then if they're going to go outside their RPE range, they can adjust that load and bring the load down. By the same token, if they're below the goal range, then they can increase it. Now, APRE, autoregulatory progressive resistance exercise, a way to progress load. This is our second thing to do with autoregulation, our second type, how to progress it. If we take this plus set here, we can see 6x4 plus on this last day of the week. That means 5 sets of 4, and then the 6th set is a plus set, or as the internet says, an AMRAP set, as many reps as possible. So at 80% here, what we do is on that last set, somebody do as many as they can. Let's say they get 8. Well, the more repetitions you get, the higher you'd increase the load for the following week. So if you get 8 reps, maybe you'd increase it by 5 kilos for the following week. If you get 6 reps, maybe you'd only increase the load by 2.5 kilos for the following week. And you could do the same thing without that plus set or AMRAP set. It's not, people think it's a rule that you have to do this AMRAP set. You don't, right? It's just one set throughout the week. And the reason that could be a negative if you progress on that is because it's only one set. You do all of these sets, let's say 9 sets, and then you have 6 more, that's 15 sets. Check out my addition skills. If we do that, we can see here that that plus set, right, that's only based upon one of those 15 sets. So if we utilize that, your excitability is probably much higher for a plus set or an AMRAP set than it is the rest of the week. So you might perform a little better than you will on the 5 sets of 6 day at 70% here, or even the early sets here because you're a little bit more jacked up for that set. Then that means the rest of the intensities you're using are predicated off of that where you have a little bit more excitability. So it might not always be the best way to do it, but that is a way of individual load progression. The other thing is you can just gauge average RPE or last set RPE, and the lower the RPE on these days, let's say you have on average a 5 RPE, you could take a large increase for the following week. But if you have an average of an 8 RPE after each set, you might keep that load the same for the following week. If somebody's better at muscular endurance and their RPE is, let's say, much lower here, a 5, but they're not as good at heavier loads, maybe they're typically a bodybuilder, they don't have great neuromuscular efficiency, and their RPE is 8 here, they might keep this load the same while increasing day 1 by 5 kilos, then those RPEs should even out as we go to the next week. So we can see that block was prescribed with percentages, and then we used RPE in conjunction with it. But of course, you can just prescribe RPE alone, but we talked about the negatives of that if somebody isn't really good with RPE or they overshoot it. So in practice, and we'll continue to move quickly here, we can see right? If we have this is one of my spreadsheets. So if you see something like this and somebody else sends it to you, it's mine. But just a screenshot here, a pretty basic spreadsheet. We can see throughout 1 week, what I'll have my clients do is I'll have the lifts in there for them. I'll have the sets and reps, and then the load. And then I'll have them give me a last set RPE. It's a lot for them, I find, to record an RPE on every single set, especially if they don't have a mobile device or something in the gym with them. So if I give them 4 sets of 7 at 172.5, I'll usually have an RPE goal in mind. And in this case, they gave me an RPE of 7. And this is during a volume block, but not a super early volume block. So our goals here are around 6 to 7 RPE, which means they met it. And then I can use that RPE. And then also we can see here this plus set, right? Squat, they had 4 sets of 3 and then 2 sets of 1 plus. I capped it at 8 reps. And on 197.5 kilos, they got 8 reps at an 8 RPE. That's good. That means they hit the cap on the 8 reps, but they also recorded some maximal RPE on it, and all of their RPEs were within range earlier in the week. So I know I can take a pretty solid load progression for the following week, and now we're also integrating concepts because I'm using what? APRE based upon the plus set, but I'm also using RPs throughout the week, and I'm using those in conjunction to progress, right? And if you notice here, if their RP was 7 after 172.5, but they ended up getting 8 on 197.5, that shows our point that this individual's probably had a little bit more excitability here, and because they thought they could have done 10 reps with almost 200 kilos, when they thought they only could have done 10 reps here with 172.5 kilos. So it shows that excitability was higher. So I take this number into account, but also I take these numbers into account so I can use both of those autoregulation strategies together to progress. So what did we learn here? RPE or RIR, because RPE measures what? Repetitions in reserve. It can be used solely to assign load. You don't have to have a percentage. You can go in, say, work up to 5 repetitions at an 8 RPE. But the drawbacks of that are somebody could overshoot that RPE initially, or just might not be very good at the RPE. So I would prefer to use it in conjunction with a percentage of 1RM, unless somebody is excellent at RPE. You give them a target percentage of 1RM that's somewhat conservative, and that will land them in their first set at the bottom or the low end of the RPE range or the goal that you have. And then they can go ahead and adjust the load up to meet that RPE, especially if they're feeling good that day. RPE, RIR can be used to progress load. The lower the RPE, right, the larger the increase in load you could take for the following week. So if you record a 4 or 5 RPE, you could probably take a pretty substantial increase. But if you record an 8 RPE on average throughout the week, then you could take a smaller increase or even keep the load the same. So inverse relationship between RPE and load increase, and then the plus or the AMRAP set, direct relationship. The more reps, the more load increase that you can take. But again, the negatives of that, it's only based upon 1 set. So you could use both of these strategies together or just use RPE to progress load. Integrate the concepts, as we say. Number 3, choose the daily training session. Well, this is called flexible programming or flexible type periodization. There's 2 studies we want to highlight that looked at that. The first is from McNamara and Stern. You can see that bolded. And if you can now look over to the figure, this uses a term what we call FNL or flexible nonlinear periodization, and then NL nonlinear periodization. What they did was there was 2 groups here, and these groups trained twice a week over 8 weeks. Right? So when we go ahead and take a look at that, I believe they trained twice a week over 12 weeks. But when we go ahead and take a look at that, that's 24 total sessions. So over those 24 sessions, 2 times a week for 12 weeks, that means that they had 8 sessions of each type, meaning they had a 20 repetition day, a 15 repetition day, and a 10 repetition day. In that, the individuals could choose over that time what they wanted to do based upon how they felt when they came in. So let's say they didn't feel very good at all when they came into the gym. They say, I'm going to do the 20 repetition day, that's the lightest load. They felt great when they came in the gym. I'm going to do the 10 repetition day, that's the heaviest load. However, they had to do each session 8 times throughout. So let's say they chose to do the 15 repetition load the first 8 times they were there. Then that 15 repetition load was done. So they had to do each load the same amount, or each loading type the same amount. We can see here at the end of the study, the FNL group, this is in leg press strength, increased strength to a significantly greater extent, noted by the asterisk, over the nonlinear group that had that fixed weekly training order. So there does seem to be some merit to say, hey, depending on how I feel this day, this is what I'm going to do when I enter the gym. Calhoun, specifically in powerlifting performance in 2017, this was reviewed in the first issue, the April issue of Mass. If you haven't read that, I strongly go back and suggest that you go back and read it as you continue on here. They noted that there was a slightly increased adherence. There wasn't an increase in strength for the flexible group, and they used the term flexible daily undulating periodization in that study, but there was an increased adherence. So what's a practical way to do this, right? Because you can gauge, I feel good, I feel bad, but you need some sort of more objective way to do that. So based upon your recovery, when you come in, here's a very practical scale adapted by Lauren in 2011. And it says, hey, I feel poorly recovered, not well recovered, moderately recovered, very well recovered. This is called the Perceived Recovery Status Scale. So a practical way to do this is if you take what Calhoun did, and we go to the next slide, they used a hypertrophy type day, a power type day, and a strength type day. Hypertrophy, moderate type repetitions, let's say 8 to 12 reps, a strength type day, lower reps, high intensity, and a power type day, an explosive type day, right? So if you have a high PRS, again, perceived recovery status, 8, 9, 10, maybe those days are when you choose the strength day, and you can say, I feel great today, I'm going to auto-regulate this in. However, you have a very low PRS. As Calhoun adapted the power days, right, they were a lighter, more explosive type of day. Man, a lot of you guys, maybe you're in school, maybe you work a full-time job, maybe it's both, maybe you work a couple jobs, you have kids, whatever it might be, you only sleep a couple hours the night before, but you say, Friday's my heavy squat day, I got to get that in today. I have good news. Your body's going to live if it doesn't squat heavy until Sunday. But you can keep that frequency, right? And if you record that low PRS because you only got a couple hours of sleep, you can account for that in your daily readiness, utilize your power day, and then move on to your strength day in the next session. Maybe you record a moderate PRS, you can utilize that hypertrophy day. But something to keep in mind is you might want to have a goal where you keep or you have to complete all of these within the same week or even within the same month, right? If you say, hey, I'm going to complete this many hypertrophy days, this many strength days, and this many power days throughout the course of the year, well, you're probably not going to equate for them across that time. It's too long. But if you say within a week, I'm going to do one hypertrophy day, one strength day, and one power day, and then you do that based upon your PRS, that's going to be a much better way to do it because you know if you've used up your hypertrophy and power days, you have to do your strength day. If your schedule is really difficult, you can extend this out to a month, and you can say, hey, I'm going to get 15 sessions this month, 5 strength, 5 hypertrophy, and 5 power, and then you can flex those in however you're feeling that type of day. And the power day really has a lot of utility here because that's a great way to utilize things if you have such a busy schedule, if you're fatigued, if you sleep little, if you have kids, I know what that's like, and you don't have much sleep, going to the next session. So that's a flexible training template, how we utilize that. A very cool table that Farman et al. Created in 2017, and Helms and I were fortunate enough to be on this paper with him. If we look at this, this was adapted for clinical populations, but the same thing. If we just go over to the right-hand column here, you can see this RPE goal. So even if you just don't have a typical hypertrophy, strength, and power type session throughout the week, maybe you have a lighter session where the stress per set in terms of RPE is 1 to 4, very low, meaning more than 6 repetitions in reserve. You have a moderate stress day where there's a 5 to 7 RPE on completion of each set, and a high stress day, 7 to 9 RPE. Well, this is like the strength day then, the 7 to 9 RPE. The more well recovered you are, the closer you can go to failure, the heavier the loads. Moderately recovered, you can flex in that moderate type day. And then if you're not well recovered, that's that power day or that low intensity day where you're staying farther from failure and just putting the work in. So what did we learn here? You can choose that session based upon daily readiness, use the flexible strategy, and you can get all of these training types in. You might say, hey, within a week, I'm going to get 1 hypertrophy, 1 strength, or 1 power day, or do 5 of each throughout the course of the month, or whatever training strategy you're using. It doesn't have to be an undulating strategy like that. Whatever you use, and then your easiest day would be a low PRS, moderate PRS, and then hardest day would be a high PRS. Use that flexible strategy. Lastly, to auto-regulate volume in the last few minutes here, well, you could do, let's say, 5 sets of 5 at 80%. But during an intensity block, you could simply say, I'm going to stop when I get to a 9 RPE, meaning this isn't a hard 5 sets. That's your max amount, right? But if you do 2 sets of 5 and then you get to a 9 RPE, it means you stop. That's what we'd call RPE stop. So you can do that during an intensity block because you don't necessarily want to decrease this load at that point to be able to complete all 5 sets if you're a few weeks out from a competition. What you'd rather do is you'd rather keep your intensity and just shut down your volume because you're not interested in damage and fatigue and so forth. Rather, you're interested in neuromuscular adaptations and you're interested in heavier loads because you want to get strength at that point. So it's especially important, I believe, during an intensity block when you really want to auto-regulate or keep volume at a certain threshold. So here's a practical way to do this. This is from a recent training program that I wrote, so you can see the spreadsheet again. So let's just say, right, in an intensity block, instead of just saying, hey, we're going to do this many sets of 5 or this many sets of 3 or this many sets of 1, what you might want to do is you might want to get some neuromuscular adaptations. So we're going to do a few things here on this slide. Let's just take this day. This is Monday. You can see a single at an 8 RPE and then by 5, meaning reps of 5 with no programmed amount of sets. at 72.5% of projected 1RM, and then they stop at an 8 RPE with a max sets of 3. That's a lot. Let's break it down. So the first thing they're doing is working up to a single at an 8 RPE, and you can see this individual worked up to 225 kilos, pretty strong. Then they're going to do sets of 5 at 72.5% of that. So, right, we have projected 1RM. So to project that 1RM, what we did was we performed 225 and an 8. That means they think they could have done this for 3 reps. 225 times our constant, 0.0333, times 3 reps, adding 225, gives us a projected 1RM right here of 247.5. Now, we want to use that projected 1RM to find our volume. We're taking what? 72.5% of that projected 1RM. So 247.5 times 72.5, or 0.725, is 180 kilos. We can see my client here, Eddie Prizeman, did 185. I see you, Eddie. I see you going above what you're supposed to do. He's the man. He's doing a tremendous job. We see that here. He actually did 185, so it's close enough. Now, he does 3 max sets of volume. He stops when he gets to an 8 RPE. We can see an RPE of 6, 7, and 7, and then there's no more. He never hit the 8 RPE, but he was able to get all 3 sets in on his volume, right? So he stopped there. If we go down here and we go to Friday squat, and we can see that he did a single at an 8 at 225, projected his max again, and then took 82.5% of that into doubles. He had a max sets of 4. We only see 1 RPE in 8. Well, what was our stop? Our RPE stop was 8. So we didn't make the max sets. He stopped after 1 set because he hit that RPE of 8, and that's what we wanted. We got our high intensity work in. We actually had 3 squats here at 225, 222.5, and 225, very heavy throughout that week. But we didn't do a lot of volume. We're preparing for a competition. So the RPE stopped. He stopped at 8. He was only able to get 1 set in here and 3 sets in here. That's okay. If he kept going, his RPE would have gone to 9, 10, creating fatigue. We don't want that close to a competition. Conclusions in summary: the 4 ways to auto-regulate: assign, adjust load, progress load, utilize a flexible template, and then session volume using RPE stop, especially during an intensity block. We talked about using some of these together. And remember, auto-regulation is not a standalone strategy. It should be used in conjunction with a periodized program. Thanks, guys. Hope you enjoyed this webinar from Mass. I'll see you here in just a few minutes and hope to stick around and see you in May for our next issue.
Hey guys, Greg Knuckles here. Hope you're enjoying this webinar so far. What I'm going to be presenting on is the relationship between training intensity and hypertrophy. So does the intensity range, and by extension rep range you train in, influence the degree of hypertrophy that will take place on kind of a per unit of volume, per set, etc. level? So 3 things we're going to address is: what do people expect to happen with increased or differing training intensities? 2, what does the literature actually have to say on the subject? And 3, what are the practical applications, of course, because that's what we all care about. So just to warn you, this is my 3rd time attempting to record this. The first time it was like an hour and a half long. The second time it was like 55 minutes long, and I'm trying to get through it in 20 minutes so I don't bore you to tears. So this is going to go pretty quick, but hopefully I'll still be able to get into enough detail with each of these studies that it's beneficial for you. So first, let's start with expectations. The expectation among a lot of people is that there's kind of this well-defined hypertrophy range, maybe between 6 to 15 reps per set, or maybe more narrowly between 8 to 12 reps per set or so. And so people who have this idea of a hypertrophy range, they can hold a strong or weak version of this position. So kind of the strong version is that you have to train in this rep range and this intensity range if you want to grow. Like, you may be able to get just minimal muscle growth training heavier or lighter, but if you want really meaningful muscle growth to take place, you have to train in this rep range. The weaker version of this position basically holds that, yes, you can make gains in other rep ranges and other intensity ranges, but kind of on a per unit of volume or on a per set basis, you'll get meaningfully more hypertrophy within kind of this narrow range of around 60 to 80% 1 rep max, corresponding with somewhere between 6 and 15-ish reps per set. If you go heavier than that or lighter than that, you're not going to get nearly as much growth. So people who hold this position propose a few potential issues you might run into with either high loads or low loads. So proposed problems with high loads, low reps, is one, people kind of start with an assumption that volume load is what is primarily predictive of hypertrophy. And generally volume loads are going to be quite a bit lower. So sets times reps times weight. Training with high loads and low reps, unless you do way more sets to compensate. And the second issue that people propose may arise is that maybe you can't feel the target muscle quite as well because you're straining so hard to lift the load. Other support muscles are going to come in, and so you can't really target those muscles you're trying to grow. That's a mark against low rep, high load training that people throw out sometimes. And then people also propose some issues with low loads and very high reps. One is people kind of have this assumption that fewer motor units are recruited with low loads. Let me just say that that's an unjustified assumption, but we don't have nearly enough time to get into why that's an unjustified assumption. And then another potential thing people will throw out is that tension in the muscle is going to be too low once you get below the hypertrophy range. So, maybe there's a threshold of tension in the muscle that you have to meet or cross before a lot of muscle growth is going to take place. That's something that a lot of people think. So, with that out of the way, what a lot of people expect, let's look to see what the literature actually has to say. So we're going to go chronologically. I'm going to give you a brief description of the training participants and also the program involved. Much briefer than the original super long version of this lecture. And throughout, I'm going to keep a running tally of the studies themselves, were the participants trained or not, how did they equate for volume, so was it per set or was it looking at volume load, and then also to see if there were significant or non-significant differences in hypertrophy in each study, so we can compare at the end. And one other thing, I only looked at studies that would be relevant to the people watching this. So studies where the participants actually trained hard, relatively close to failure. So a lot of studies went to failure. Some, it was probably around 2-ish reps from failure or so, but not just some weird kind of contrived training program. So for example, there was one paper by, I believe the researcher's name was Holm, comparing sets of 12 at 70%. Okay, cool, that sounds good. With 360 singles at 15.5%, with either 5 or 10 seconds between reps, which that's not meaningful to me or hopefully I would assume most of you watching this. So yeah, studies where people actually trained hard. Okay, so first study directly looking at this, Masuda et al. 1999. Old study, 18 years old, but a lot of people aren't aware of a lot of this literature, and especially not a fair amount of the pretty good older stuff here. So this study, maintenance of myoglobin concentration in human skeletal muscle after heavy resistance training. Ironically, it wasn't even, the main thing it was looking at wasn't even hypertrophy, it was looking at myoglobin concentration, obviously. That was the main thing they were interested in, but it's also, as far as I can tell, the first good applicable study investigating this research question. So the relationship between training intensity and hypertrophy. So 2 groups here, one training at 90% 1 rep max for 5 sets at 2. One group doing 3 rest pause to drop sets, starting at 80 and then 70 and then 60%, and then doing a set to failure, resting, I believe it was 15 seconds, dropping 10%, doing another set to failure, dropping 10%, doing another set to failure. And so in this study, there was no significant difference in hypertrophy looking at quad muscle fiber cross-sectional area, and volume was not equated in this study. So the 90% 1 rep max group did more sets if you count each rest pause drop set as a single, like, self-contained but extended set. But volume load was higher in the group doing the drop sets. So similar hypertrophy, but volume was not equated. Next study, effects of 4 and 10 repetition maximum weight training protocols on neuromuscular adaptations in untrained men by Chestnut et al., also 1999, good old study. Untrained participants, one group doing 6 sets with a 4 rep max load, one group doing 3 sets with a 10 rep max load. The main way they assessed hypertrophy in this study was cross-sectional area of lean tissue of the entire upper arm. So that would be biceps, brachialis, triceps, and your humerus. And there was no significant difference in hypertrophy here. So obviously the group training with 4 rep max loads did more sets, but they equated volume here via volume load. So sets times reps times weight. Next study, gross measures of exercise-induced muscular hypertrophy by Weiss et al., 2000. Participants here, untrained males. Every group did 4 sets, so this was equated based on number of sets, not volume load. One group was training heavy with 3 to 5 rep max loads. One group in kind of that hypertrophy zone with 13 to 15 rep max loads. And the other group considerably lighter than that with 23 to 25 rep max loads. They assessed hypertrophy 2 different ways. They took, one, they measured muscle thicknesses of the quads and hamstrings, and they also just looked at thigh circumferences. Of those, muscle thickness is a much more reliable and valid measure of hypertrophy, so that's what I focused on. And there were no significant or meaningful differences between groups in increases in quad or hamstring muscle thicknesses. Next one, Campos et al., 2002, muscular adaptations in response to 3 different resistance training regimens, specificity of repetition maximum training zones. Participants, untrained males. One group did 4 sets with 3 to 5 rep max loads. One group did 3 sets with 9 to 11 rep max loads. And one group did 2 sets with 20 to 28 rep max loads. So this was equated via volume load, not by number of sets. So the groups training heavier did fewer sets. The groups training heavier did more sets. Let me clarify. So there were no significant between group differences in hypertrophy, looking at the cross-sectional area of the quads. However, pre to post, there were significant increases for the 3 to 5 rep max group and the 9 to 11 rep max group, but not a significant increase in quad cross-sectional area in the 20 to 28 rep max group, which makes you think that the 3 to 5 and 9 to 11 rep max groups probably did experience more muscle growth, just without enough statistical power to detect a between group difference there. Okay, next one, Popov et al., 2006. Hormonal adaptation determines the increase in muscle mass and strength during training without relaxation. Let me start by saying I'm not crazy about the title of this study, but that's fine. It's not the topic of this webinar. Anyway, participants, untrained males. So the 2 groups here basically had like one hard training day a week where they did like 2 to 3 times as much volume as the other 2 training days per week. They trained 3 times a week. But if you look at it on a sets per week basis, one group did 13 weekly sets to failure with 80% 1 rep max, and one group did 6 rest paused sets per week, so 3 mini sets with 30 seconds in between. So 6 rest pause sets to failure with 50% 1 rep max. There was no significant difference in hypertrophy here, looking at quad and glute muscle volume. And with the glutes, there wasn't a significant or meaningful difference, but there probably was for the quads, and there just wasn't enough statistical power to pick up on it. But there was a 15% increase in the group training with 80% 1 rep max, and only a 6% increase in the group doing the 6 weekly rest pause sets with 50% 1 rep max. It is worth noting here, however, that volume was nowhere close to equated. If you count the rest pause sets as single sets, which I do, again, that's not the topic of this webinar, why I would count them as single sets instead of multiple sets, but regardless, the way I look at it, more sets for the group training with 80% 1 rep max, and also total work performed measured in kilojoules was substantially higher for that group as well. The group training with 80% 1 rep max did basically double, or like almost exactly double the work of the group training with 50% 1 rep max. So next study, when this one was published in 2012, like I remember people like kind of just losing their minds over it, because everyone had been preaching for a long time that like you had to train at least moderately heavy to build muscle, and low load training didn't work. And then this study was published, and spoiler alert, there were no significant differences in hypertrophy between training at 80% 1 rep max and 30%. And yeah, so like everyone freaked out. But now like this study, as you'll see, has been replicated so many times, like the findings not even surprising anymore. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself, but the title, Resistance Exercise Load Does Not Determine Training-Mediated Hypertrophic Gains in Young Men by Mitchell et al. 2012. The participants, obviously untrained men. There were 3 groups in the study, but the 2 that make the most sense for us to pay attention to was a group doing 3 sets to failure with 80% 1 rep max, and a group doing 3 sets to failure with 30% 1 rep max. So they looked, to assess hypertrophy, they looked at both quad muscle volume and muscle fiber cross-sectional area. And between the group doing 3 sets at 80% and the group doing 3 sets at 30%, there weren't any statistically significant or meaningful differences between them. Like I think it was an increase in muscle volume of like 6.2% versus like 6.6%, so basically identical. And so obviously this was equated based on number of sets, not volume load. Okay, next study, Schwenke et al. 2012. This study is a bit of an outlier among them. So title, Early Phase Muscular Adaptations in Response to Slow versus Traditional Resistance Training Regimens. There was one group in this study that isn't really worth us dwelling on. They were doing super slow reps. I want to say it was like 6-second concentric and like 15-second eccentrics or something like that. But there were 2 groups training with normal rep cadences. One group was doing 9 sets with 6 to 10 rep max loads. The other group was doing 9 sets with 20 to 30 rep max loads. And the participants were untrained females, which is potentially relevant here because the vast majority of the other studies used males. And this study had very much outlier results, both in terms of total hypertrophy that occurred and also the between group differences. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself again. They found significantly greater hypertrophy in the 6 to 10 rep max group, measuring fiber cross-sectional area equated based on number of sets. And the total hypertrophy seen in the group training with 6 to 10 rep max loads was huge. I want to say the average increase was like 11% in the group training with 20 to 30 rep max loads, which is impressive. And it was like 36% in the group training with 6 to 10 rep max loads, which is just ridiculous. So yeah, huge differences between groups. And also the one group in this study had like massively more hypertrophy than you'll see in pretty much any other study. So yeah, found a significant difference between groups, but also this study is a bit of an outlier in more ways than one. Okay, 2013, Agasawara et al. Low load bench press training to fatigue results in muscle hypertrophy similar to high load bench press training. Participants were untrained males. The way they did this study is they trained doing 3 sets of 10 at 75% for I believe 10 weeks. Then they detrained for 9 months and came back. In training upon return, they were doing 4 sets to failure with 30% 1 rep max. And so between those two different time periods, hypertrophy within those two time periods was very similar, looking at pec and triceps cross-sectional area. And this wasn't reported, but just comparing the parameters of this study to other studies, volume load was likely similar. But a potential confounder here is that all of the participants trained with 75% 1 rep max first, then detrained, and then retrained. So potentially, quote unquote, muscle memory was playing a load here, or playing a role here, I mean. It tends to be easier to regain muscle you've lost than to build new muscle in the first place. So that's a potential confounder in this study. So the table at the end of the slideshow, I will not be including it in there. Okay, next, and I think a lot of people watching this are going to be aware of this study, Schoenfeld et al. 2014, effects of different volume-equated resistance training loading strategies on muscular adaptations in well-trained men. So the participants were trained men, which is a bit of a change from the other studies we've looked at so far. Comparing 7 sets at 3 rep max loads versus 3 sets at 10 rep max loads, and found similar hypertrophy between groups, assessed via biceps thickness. And so similar hypertrophy here, comparing high load and moderate load training, equated based on volume load, not number of sets. Okay, however, that study contrasts a bit with this one by Mangine et al. 2015, the effects of training volume and intensity on improvements in muscular strength and size in resistance trained men. Participants were trained males, similar to the Schoenfeld paper. One group did 4 sets with 3 to 5 rep max loads, and the other group did 4 sets with 10 to 12 rep max loads. So here it was equated based on number of sets, not volume load. And overall, hypertrophy was similar between groups, but lean arm mass was significantly greater post-training for the 3 to 5 rep max group. And there were also some non-significant changes that also leaned in favor of the 3 to 5 rep max group over the 10 to 12 rep max group. So you'll see that contrasts a bit with this Schoenfeld paper and another one we're going to see soon. So in this one, similar hypertrophy when volume load was equated, but that required more sets from the 3 rep max group. Here, number of sets were equated, and there was actually slightly greater hypertrophy perhaps in the 3 to 5 rep max group versus the 10 to 12 rep max group. Okay, next paper, effects of low versus high load resistance training on muscle strength and hypertrophy in well-trained men by Schoenfeld et al. 2015. This study basically replicated the findings of that 2012 Mitchell paper, but in trained subjects instead of untrained subjects. So training at 8 to 12 rep max loads versus 20 to 35 rep max loads equated based on number of sets. And similar hypertrophy between the two groups, looking at the biceps, triceps, and quads, measuring muscle thickness. Okay, next. This paper also isn't going to be included in the table at the end because the difference in loading wasn't different enough, I would say. The total range here was between 60 and 85% 1 rep max, which I would generally consider between about 60 and 80% 1 rep max to be what most people sort of consider that hypertrophy range. So most of the training for both of those groups kind of fell within that. But I just wanted to point this paper out because it's, for people watching this webinar who are powerlifters, it's a very well done paper that also semi-addresses this question. Comparing slightly heavier loads to slightly lighter loads with volume equated, looking at both hypertrophy and strength, equated based on relative volume, so sets times reps times percent 1 rep max. So yeah, this was a really cool paper comparing 2 different DUP setups one between 60 and 70% 1 rep max for 4 to 5 sets of 8 to 12, with one day at 60% for 12s, one day at 65% for 10s, one day at 70% for 8s, 2 training at 75 to 85% 1 rep max, one day I believe was 8 sets of 6, one day was I think 8 sets of 4, and one day was 10 sets of 2. So yeah, kind of sets and reps that would probably look similar to a lot of people's powerlifting programs. So very cool paper, very applicable paper, which was similar enough to the other studies we're looking at that I wanted to give it a little plug. You should definitely read it. Okay, next one, Morton et al., 2016. Neither load nor systemic hormones determine training-mediated hypertrophy or strength gains in resistance-trained young men. Obviously, the participants were trained males. This was essentially a replication of Mitchell and Schoenfeld, but again, in trained participants. So one group doing 3 sets at 8 to 12 rep max loads, one group doing 3 sets at 20 to 25 rep max loads, hypertrophy assessed via changes in cross-sectional area of both type 1 and type 2 fibers. And hypertrophy of both fiber types was very similar between both loading zones. And so that was obviously equated based on number of sets and not volume load. Okay, next one, Fink et al., 2016. Effects of high versus low fixed loads and nonlinear training loads on muscle hypertrophy, strength, and force development. The reason I included this paper and not the Schoenfeld DUP paper is because this one did actually have 2 groups that trained exclusively in single loading zones. So one group did 3 sets to failure at 80% 1 rep max, one group did 3 sets to failure at 30% 1 rep max, and one group alternated between 30 and 80% 1 rep max every 2 weeks. So 2 weeks training at 30%, 2 weeks training at 80%, etc. So in all 3 groups, very similar hypertrophy, looking at biceps cross-sectional area, and it was equated based on number of sets, not volume load. Okay, next, this is the other Schoenfeld paper. I said that contrasted with the Mangine study we saw earlier. Differential effects of heavy versus moderate loads on measures of strength and hypertrophy in resistance-trained men, Schoenfeld et al., 2016. Participants, trained males, equated based on number of sets, so both groups doing 3 sets, one group training with 3 rep max loads, the other group training with 10 rep max loads. So there was similar hypertrophy for the biceps and triceps, definitely similar for the triceps, maybe a non-significant difference in favor of the biceps for the 10 rep max group, and then a significant difference for the quads, with a larger increase in muscle thickness for the 10 rep max group versus the 3 rep max group. So much like the Mangine paper, this was equated based on number of sets, but whereas the Mangine paper found one significant and a few non-significant differences in favor of training with 3 to 5 rep max loads, this paper found one significant and one non-significant difference in favor of training with 10 rep max loads over 3 rep max loads. One potential difference between the studies is slightly shorter for the moderate training intensity group in the Mangine paper, so that is potentially a confounder there. Some research shows that limiting rest periods may decrease hypertrophy to some degree. So that is worth noting, but at the same time, there's not also all that much research on rest periods yet. So at this point, this paper and the Mangine paper, similar subjects, similar setup, coming to different conclusions about the effects of these 2 different rep ranges on hypertrophy when the number of sets are equated. Okay, next, Jenkins et al., 2016, neuromuscular adaptations after 2 and 4 weeks of 80% versus 30% 1 repetition and maximum resistance training to failure. Participants and trained men, one group doing 3 sets at 30%, one group doing 3 sets at 80%. Short-term study, only 4 weeks, but no significant difference in biceps muscle thickness, equated based on number of sets, not volume load. And now we are to the end of this, this research rundown. Paper published just last month, which I'll note is in our May issue of Mass, Nobrega et al., 2017, Effect of Resistance Training to Muscle Failure or Volitional Interruption at High and Low Intensities on Muscle Mass and Strength. The participants were untrained males. There were 4 groups here, 2 groups training at 30% 1 rep max, 2 groups training at 80% 1 rep max. 130 and 180% 1 rep max group went to failure every set, and 130 and 180% 1 rep max group stopped just shy of failure, so didn't actually miss a rep, but stopped when they were confident they weren't going to get another one. And similar quad hypertrophy, looking at cross-sectional area in all 4 groups. No significant or meaningful differences between groups here. Okay, so let's sum up all of these studies. So here in the first column, I have the study and year. Next, I have were the participants trained or untrained. Next column, was volume equated, and if so, how was it equated? Was it number of sets or was it volume load? And then last column, was there a significant or a non-significant difference in hypertrophy? So a couple of things to look at here. This is comparing moderate intensity, so kind of 60 to 80% 1 rep max, to low intensity, so less than 60% 1 rep max. The vast majority, there were no significant or meaningful differences between groups. The couple of studies just to point out really quick is Campos, the second row there. There was no significant difference, but there was a non-significant difference in favor of moderate intensity over low intensity when volume load was equated, so not number of sets, but volume load, meaning fewer sets training with low intensities. Popov et al. Also a non-significant difference in favor of moderate intensities for quad growth, but not glute growth. And it's worth pointing out here, volume was nowhere close to equated, both in terms of number of sets and volume load. It was way higher for the moderate intensity group than the low intensity group, so kind of makes sense that they would experience more hypertrophy. And then finally, the Schwenke study, where number of sets were equated and there was just way more hypertrophy in the moderate rep group. But among all of these studies, it's the one that really kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. One, because it used different participants, so it used women, whereas I think most or all of the rest used exclusively men. So that's definitely something that should be researched more. Maybe women respond differently to different rep ranges than men do, so that's definitely something that researchers should follow up on. And also just the amount of hypertrophy that took place in the study was astronomical, so it kind of sticks out. Other than that, we can see a bunch of studies comparing low to moderate intensities equated based on number of sets, where there's no significant difference in hypertrophy on both trained and untrained subjects. So we have Weiss, we have Mitchell, we have Schoenfeld 2015, Morton, Fink, Jenkins, Nobrega. All of them equated based on number of sets and found no difference in hypertrophy between moderate and low load training. Okay, now comparing moderate intensities to high intensities, so that's 60 to 80% 1 rep max to heavier than 80% 1 rep max, fewer than 5 reps per set or fewer. So again, just to point out, most of these studies found no significant difference in hypertrophy. Some of them equated based on volume load, and all of them that equated based on volume load found no difference in hypertrophy. Looking at the ones that equated based on number of sets, we have Weiss. Using untrained participants, there was no significant difference or meaningful difference. And then we have Mangine and Schoenfeld, which both equated based on number of sets Mangine showing slight benefits, one significant difference, and a few non-significant differences in favor of 3 to 5 rep max loads versus more moderate loads. And Schoenfeld finding a significant difference for quads and a non-significant difference for biceps in favor of 10 rep max loads over 3 rep max loads. So just comparing moderate intensities to low intensities, I feel very, very confident saying as long as you're doing the same number of sets near failure, hypertrophy is going to be very similar. Comparing moderate to high intensities, I feel very confident saying if volume load is equated, hypertrophy is going to be very similar. And thus far in studies equating number of sets, we have one study showing no difference, one showing benefits for moderate intensity, and one showing benefits for high intensity. So I did actually look at the stats individually for each of these, and they do sort of meet in the middle, just pointing that out. And then also they're conflicting. So I wouldn't feel incredibly confident saying that if you equated high intensity and moderate intensity based on number of sets that hypertrophy would be similar, but that's sort of the equilibrium that the research is at right now. And it's definitely a subject that needs more research to clarify further. Okay, so summarizing all of this, comparing high and moderate intensities, when volume load is equated, hypertrophy is going to be very, very similar. But it's not quite as clear what happens when you equate number of sets. One study, Mangine, says that maybe high intensity is better, so 85% 1 rep max plus. One study, Schoenfeld, says that maybe moderate intensity is better. And one study, Weiss, showed no difference. So that's still not clear at all yet. When comparing moderate and low intensity, if you equate number of sets, hypertrophy is going to be very, very similar. And then finally, and I feel like I need to point this out, there were 16 studies here. 11 of them used untrained participants and 5 of them used trained participants. And those studies did not differ systematically. The studies on untrained participants came to identical conclusions to the ones on trained participants, by and large, with the Schwinke study just being kind of weird and out of left field. Okay, so practical considerations. Even though on a per set basis, it seems that kind of anywhere between sets of 3 to 5-ish and sets of 30 to 40-ish, hypertrophy is similar on a per set basis. From a pragmatic standpoint, training with a more moderate intensity, so maybe between 6 and 15 reps per set, may be preferable. Generally 1, because if you're doing the same number of sets within those intensity ranges, joint wear and tear is going to be a little bit lower. A lot of people find with moderate intensities versus high intensities. 10 sets of 8 is not the same as 10 heavy triples. It may be when you're weak, but when those 10 heavy triples are 500-600 pounds, it adds up. And your body sort of hates you after a while. And then also comparing moderate to low intensity training is just much more metabolically crushing. So if you're comparing maybe 5 sets of 8 squats to 5 sets of 25 squats, assuming the sets of 8 and the sets of 25 are taken very close to failure, if you survive the 5 sets of 25, either you're stand efforting or you're not human. So you're not human regardless. That's just way worse in terms of survivability of the workout. If you're getting the same basic outcome from training with 25 reps per set or 8 reps per set, you'd be a fool not to do 8 reps. It's same benefit, but just it's not as soul crushing. I will note that that's primarily true for multi-joint exercises. So if you want to throw in sets of 20 on bicep curls just to catch a sick pump, by all means go for it. Like that's great. But yeah, sets of like 20 plus reps for heavy compound exercises. Scientifically, it may be very similar in terms of hypertrophy on a per set basis, but practically you're probably not going to be able to handle as many sets per workout just because metabolically they're crushing. Okay, so my general advice here is that the primary lifts you base your program around, just experiment to see what general rep range or general intensity range allows you to tolerate the most hard sets within a training session or across a training week. And this is going to vary person to person and exercise to exercise, and that's perfectly fine. So, for example, for squats, maybe you're a pretty strong squatter and sets of 10 to 12 are really, really hard for you. Set of 10 squats may not be like that metabolically demanding if you're squatting 275 pounds, but if you're squatting 475 pounds for sets of 10, that's going to be very, very hard. So maybe you're a strong squatter, and so you find that kind of that sweet spot there is maybe sets of 6 to 8. Whereas for maybe dumbbell incline, it might be sets of 12 or something like that. Yeah, so just experiment with the main lifts in your program. See what kind of that happy middle range is for you. And then since there is some research, and by some research I mean one study by Schoenfeld, showing that training with a variety of rep ranges may be more beneficial than sticking within a single rep range. It's not just that study. Like, my experience backs that up. Most good lifters and jacked people don't train in the same intensity range all the time. But yeah, so as a general rule, I think you should do roughly 2/3 of your weekly or monthly volume, depending how you periodize things, kind of in that like optimal happy rep range for you. But then get a couple sets that are a little bit heavier than that and a couple sets that are a little bit lighter than that. So just how this could look practically, let's say you're squatting. Let's say you want to get 10 sets for legs, and let's say that means 10 sets of squats because you're awesome. What that could look like is maybe you find that for you, sets of 6 to 8 work really well for the squat. It's, they keep your joints happy, but they're not just metabolically crushing. So maybe you start your workout by working up to an overwarm triple, say, at maybe 85-90% 1 rep max, just one set, just to get your body used to feeling heavy weight, or if you're in a hypertrophy block as a power lifter, to keep your body comfortable with heavy weights. Then maybe you drop back to around 75-80% 1 rep max for those sets of 6 to 8. Maybe you do 7 sets there, and you finish it up with maybe 1 high rep set of squats and maybe 1 high rep set of lunges. So you've done those 10 sets, you've done 7 of the sets in that loading zone that you found to be optimal for your squat. You've gotten a little bit of a heavier stimulus, and you've gotten a little bit of a lighter stimulus as well. You could also set this up kind of like on a session by session basis. So if you're training, let's say you're squatting twice let's use another lift. Are there other lifts? Maybe. Let's say bench. Let's say you find that your bench does really well with sets of 8 to 10 when you're in a hypertrophy block. And let's say you're benching twice a week. So over 5 weeks, you have 10 bench sessions. And so maybe that's going to be 6 bench sessions that are kind of within that optimal rep range for you. And then maybe you have 2 heavy sessions where you're working up to heavy sets of 3 to 5. And then maybe you have 2 lighter sessions where you're working at 15-20 reps per set. So it doesn't all have to be within a given workout or even a given week. You could kind of spread that out over a longer time span. And I think based on my own experience, that's an efficient way to get the majority of your training volume kind of in a range that lets you handle the most volume. While also, if you are going to get any additional benefits from novelty and just from variation, that's an efficient and effective way to set that up. One other thing I'll note is, even though I do tend to think that hypertrophy is pretty similar on a per set basis within the majority of the range that's been researched, so between maybe 3 to 5-ish reps per set up to maybe 30-ish reps per set, I do think there is probably a limit. I highly doubt you're going to get similar hypertrophy doing 5 heavy singles versus 5 sets of 10, or by doing sets of 200 versus sets of 8 or something like that. I just don't think that's going to happen. But within the majority of the intensity ranges and rep ranges that the majority of people would be training in, it does seem like hypertrophy is very similar on a per set basis for the most part. I feel very safe saying that, comparing moderate loads, moderate reps to low loads, high reps. Between moderate loads, moderate reps, and high loads, low reps, I feel very confident saying if volume load is equated, hypertrophy is going to be similar. And thus far, the research seems to suggest that there's not much difference on a per set basis either, but more research is needed to elucidate that further. Last thing I want to say is that you should be keeping up with the research on this. I would be very surprised if more than maybe 3 or 4 people watching this were actually aware of all of the papers mentioned in this webinar and had actually read them all. I think it's important to keep up with the research here because this is an area of research that's very relevant and applicable to what we do. I mean, how much weight should you lift if you want to get jacked? Like that's the most practical, basic bro tier question possible. Like if you're interested in research and you want to get jacked, it doesn't get better and more basic than that. And yeah, like the results of the research run counter to a lot of the bro logic here. It doesn't really seem like there's that meaningful of a difference between rep ranges when it comes to hypertrophy, as long as you're doing about the same number of sets. So I think, one, it's important to stay up on the research just so you don't come to wrong conclusions like that. And also just because, like, even among people who I know value research, a lot of people just aren't aware of all or even most of these studies. So I see the same handful, maybe 5 or 6 papers linked all the time. And like, I'll mention one of these other studies and no one's heard of it. So there's a ton of research here. Like, I think there were 16 studies in this presentation. And I think most people at best are aware of half to a third of them. But yeah, there's a pretty large, robust body of literature here. And I think even for people who do try to keep up with it, they've missed a lot along the way. So I think it's beneficial to make a bit more of an effort to keep up with something like this. And just to reiterate, like this is something that's like as basic and important as it could possibly be if you're looking for like a research topic that's relevant to bros. So yeah, and that about wraps up all I have. So I really hope you've enjoyed this webinar, and Q&A is going to start shortly, so stick around. Oh, what's up, guys?
Can you hear us?
If we're live here right now, type in the chat just so I know.
I think we are, fellas.
Okay.
All right.
So how's it going, guys? How was that? Did everyone love it?
Was your favorite part the dings?
By a show
The
of
dings, right?
By a show of hands,
Thanks, David.
who liked the training stuff more than the diet stuff?
Everybody. You don't even need to take a vote on that. Everybody did.
So it goes
Hey guys, I got an idea.
training, diet. Got
I
it.
got an idea. We're all here to talk about training, so Eric's going to spend 20 minutes talking about dieting. How about we just talk about lifting weights instead? We could do that. How about we live in that time?
Look, you can't lift weights unless you have an eating disorder. Okay, we know that. All right. So
thanks, David. David, appreciate it, man. I'm not listening to Eric. Thanks, David.
Oh, thanks, Bronislav.
Eric's presentation was David. David, please take out Bronislav.
Thank you, Luca.
Bronislav, glad you enjoyed
Thank you, Tool.
Eric's, man. Both, to be honest. See you guys in SBS.
What
I
if
think we have.
That's what I like to hear.
Shiva, that's the best kind of resistance training.
Hey, Michael, we certainly will, man. Hey, seriously, I know we were joking there, but all you guys that love the nutrition stuff and the training stuff, that's awesome, man. We really enjoyed answering the questions throughout. There was a lot on there, and we tried to do as best we could to keep up with them, but we have the live Q&A. Greg's going to take us into it in just a minute here. Thanks, Bratislav. No worries, man. Glad you enjoyed Eric's. That's fantastic. So glad that we could answer all of those in here for you, man. But Greg, what do you got, dude?
Yeah, so we can broadcast questions as they come up in here, and we'll just stick around and answer questions as long as there are still people asking questions. Just to reiterate really quick, as the deans made you aware, the mass sale is now open. There have been, I think, like 150 people who have bought so far or so. So at this point, there's not that much risk of missing out on the sale before this webinar is over.
We mean by now? They're going fast.
But they will likely be gone within the next couple of days. So if you're interested, get on that. And with that little pitch out of the way, first question: does the fact that hypertrophy is the same, or I would amend that to say similar, on a set basis suggest there's a minimum TUT requirement for hypertrophy to occur? So I would answer that by primarily just saying I don't think time under tension is something you need to worry about all that much. So I'm kind of, to take that idea to its logical conclusion, the best way to build muscle and get stronger would be to lift every rep really slow, right? Like spend a ton of time under tension. Whereas research shows that with really, really like long rep durations, you actually get less hypertrophy. And with longer rep durations, you also tend to get like smaller strength benefits as well. So I think that when you're looking at training volume, I think sets is generally the best way to go about it. And then volume load is all right if you're comparing similar exercises. And if you're staying within a small intensity range, number of reps works okay. And relative volume works pretty well also. Percent 1 rep max times sets times reps. But I don't think that time under tension is really something you need to even think about or worry about all that much.
Hey, James, I'm going to type something now. I'm going to try to do it really soft. Could anybody, James, how was that, dude? I tried like super hard to do that. So hopefully that worked out well. Just to parallel off of Greg's response there with time under, Eric, I'm speaking. With time under tension, I totally agree with him that time under tension isn't, no problem, dude. Time under tension isn't something that's super important. Hey, James. How's that? Time under tension is not super important, but I think relative volume is something that's pretty key, meaning sets times reps times percentage of 1 RM. So if you're doing 3 sets of 8 at 70%, 3 times 8 times 0.70, and you can really only compare absolute volume, meaning sets times reps times weight lifted to yourself. That's not a between person comparison. If I'm going to compare my absolute volume to Greg's absolute volume is almost surely going to be higher unless I'm doing an astronomical amount of sets because he's so much stronger. So I think that relative volume, we can look between each other if we're doing similar relative volume, but also volume is dependent upon training age. So we have to understand that volume is going to progress over time on a relative sense, but it should also progress gradually over time. There's substantial evidence to suggest that in the short term, a high amount of volume is not as good as a moderate or low amount of volume. So sometimes we all take this volume thing a little bit too much. And in the first issue of Mass, we talked about this, and we reviewed a study where high amounts of volume actually didn't work as much as well as a moderate amount of volume. So just be careful about that and be gradually progressing volume over time. If you're here and you're doing 2,000 kilos of volume a week on an exercise, and then you immediately jump to 20,000 kilos a week, well, there's a few problems with this. One, you run the risk of injury. And two, you've missed out on all this progress in between with no guarantee you're going to get a better adaptation from 20,000 kilos as opposed to 10,000 or 5,000. So progress gradually over time and be very concerned with how much that you're increasing. Eric is smirking, so something must be going on in the chat.
Don't worry about it. So, yeah, I agree with both of them. I think they put it pretty well. Should we move on to Shiva's question?
Go for it.
Cool. The question is, Eric, would you rather see mechanistic research on refeeds, like the effect on leptin, or training nutrition interventions to see the effects on training quality performance? So I'm going to kind of answer what I think you're asking, Shiva, is that if I wanted to see data on refeeds, I would want to see applied studies with maybe a mechanistic element. And what I mean by that is I would like to see a long-term diet and resistance trained individuals who are not overweight actually using different refeed strategies. And then just to see what happens in an applied sense. Mechanistic research can only get you so far, and especially with the application. Basically, I think there's a train of how research should go. Mechanism, which generates some hypotheses and helps us kind of understand what's happening, leads to applied research, which leads to practice. So anytime you're trying to figure out what to do as a practitioner or as an athlete, your first port of call would be that applied research. Of course, if there's absolutely no mechanistic research, then you just can't state why it works. You just know that it does. So in an ideal sense, maybe you would take some hormonal markers along with just looking at those outcomes, comparing different protocols, and then you can speculate as to maybe why what happened. And then you can keep improving on the protocol based on that knowledge. But I think we've had a lot of debate on refeeds already just based on leptin responses and total energy expenditure responses. And I think that's a very reductionist way of looking at the potential effect of refeeds or just coming out of a caloric deficit intermittently. And it's probably assuming too much on the other side of it, probably too conservative.
All right. Looks like another one for you as well, Eric. Your thoughts on people with exceptionally high or low leptin and how that should relate to refeeds?
Well, in a practical sense, you're not going to know your leptin levels. And it's not the only hormone that matters. If you're in and leptin doesn't always do what you think it does either. So, for example, obese people who are struggling to lose weight typically have the highest leptin levels. So it's clearly not just a fix-all hormone. And so, yeah, I mean, if you are lean and you have chronically low leptin levels, that probably indicates you're trying to stay too lean and you're constantly in a calorie deficit. But the interesting thing is leptin drops really quick in response to a calorie deficit. And, getting it to spike back up may or may not have the effects that we want to see. And even if you were to look at the studies where they actually inject leptin into people, it takes about 5 weeks of leptin injections at hugely much higher levels than you'd get from an endogenous response to carbohydrate refeed to start reversing everything that happens in response to dieting. So I'm not sure actually that leptin is the only thing we should be paying attention to. And it may not be even the most important marker. It might be something like just insulin levels or something else, but that's just speculation on my part. So I don't know how important that would be. Again, I would refer back to my statement about applied research probably being where we want to look.
All right. Next one, thoughts on exercise selection or variation for hypertrophy. Is once a month or too excessive? Do you want to take this, Mike?
Yeah, let me just make sure I'm understanding. Thoughts on exercise selection variation for hypertrophy. Is once a month or too excessive? Is the question saying in terms of variation, varying the exercise once or twice a month?
Probably. How frequently do you change exercise?
Yeah, I don't think that's too excessive. What I would say is that, first let me start a little bit more basic, whereas is it a requirement to get, let's say, or to do squats, bench presses, and deadlifts for hypertrophy? It's certainly not a requirement. I think you're going to get the most bang for your buck for those exercises. So I would recommend utilizing them. Let's say squats for the lower body as your primary exercise, assuming you don't have any sort of contraindication or any sort of injury that's precluding you from doing that. But let's say you choose your major exercise or two. So let's say you have squats and deadlifts, or squats and hack squats, something like that, or squats and lunges. I would recommend keeping those two exercises most of the time without altering those too much that month, unless you're doing some sort of variation, a squat to a front squat. And then alter the assistance work exercises kind of as you please. If you don't feel like doing rows one day and you'd rather do more pull-ups, or you'd rather do seated rows as opposed to barbell rows, that's totally fine. But the one reason I like to keep a main exercise, even for hypertrophy, is because since you're not necessarily, you don't have an ultrasound at your disposal, or you're not able to take muscle thickness measurements or hypertrophy measurements on a daily basis, strength is a decent indicator. So if you're still increasing strength, that's a pretty good way to be able to gauge, hey, my squat's gone up 20 pounds. That's certainly going to be good for hypertrophy. It's not a bad thing. So I like to keep the main exercises in there to an extent. If a powerlifter might do them 3 times a week and you don't feel like benching or squatting 3 times a week, the good news is you don't have to. You can do them once or twice a week. I know, right? But I would keep them in there at least that once or twice a week so you can gauge your progress strength-wise, and that will help give you an indicator, especially as you're getting into prep, that would allow you to be able to have some sort of practical gauge on it. But in terms of the assistance exercises, yeah, it's nice to be able to do, let's say, barbell rows maybe once a week or something like that to keep looking at your strength on that. But that's not as important. I would say have the freedom to be able to choose and move those assistance exercises around as you want for what you enjoy. But if you do have a main lift, keep it at least once, maybe twice a week, and then change the assistance so that way you can gauge your progress strength-wise. So you have some sort of practical indicator of how you're doing on those. But again, choose the exercises that you enjoy. If you hate squatting and you're not going to adhere to it, then don't do it. Choose something that you like in that case. But that would be my response to that. I don't know if Eric has anything to add.
Yeah, I'm pretty similar. I mean, from a practical perspective with my bodybuilders, most of the time I have I think of main lifts as beyond just the big 3 because they're not a power lifter. So I would say, a row is just as, if not more important than a deadlift for a bodybuilder, for example. So I will often have a handful of compound movements that I try to keep in at least once per week, almost all the time. And then, there'll be phases where the frequency is higher on those lifts, or we'll change accessory movements, or go to different variations. But it tends to be longer periods where we switch out from a compound movement because, for one thing, there's some research showing that you can start making hypertrophic gains on a single joint movement pretty quickly just because the skill level is so low. So what you wouldn't want to do is constantly change out the compound movements that are more skilled, because that could be interfering with your ability to grow muscle earlier. And you'd be kind of in that constant learning phase. You would feel like you're making gains because every time you came back to one you hadn't done for a while, you'd have these rapid neuromuscular changes. But that's not what you want as a bodybuilder.
If I can just parallel off of Eric's answer there as well and continue on this from Mel. And Jan, that's a fantastic decision.
Oh, not going to sleep.
I like it. Committed. That's dedication right there. So just to parallel off on Eric's response, and we kind of gave the same response there, I agree wholeheartedly, is, just if we think about somebody that's in prep now, and something that I try to use successfully with some bodybuilders that I've programmed for over the last few years that have done really well is, since strength declines pretty rapidly, and obviously dieting is going to take a huge toll on that, and fatigue is going to take a huge toll on strength, one of the ways to maintain strength is through neuromuscular adaptations, like Eric said. This doesn't mean that a bodybuilder should neglect this. So if, let's say, a bodybuilder is in prep and they work up to, let's say, before their volume work, a single at an 8 RPE once a week on a main lift, well, that's a pretty good way to be able to maintain strength, or at least attenuate the rate of strength loss. If they do that, then when they drop to their volume work, the load that they're using might be a little bit higher, which means that their volume might be higher. So there is some utility in using the main lifts by working up to a heavyish single sometimes. If you are able to maintain that strength from a neuromuscular perspective, then when you drop to your volume work, your load is higher, thus your volume is a little bit higher. So that could be a decent tool, and also to help somebody maintain strength a little bit, to help them be able to maintain a little bit more volume through the load that they're using once they get later into prep. So that's a little bit outside the box for the question, but that's just, if you're using strength as an indicator, you can use it in that way as well.
All right. Okay. Can you give an estimate for the number of sets per week for maximal hypertrophy, and also how specific is that to body part? So I can take this one. We're not sure. So we know for sure it does vary person to person. In terms of Mike, that's super loud. In terms of what the average sets per week is to maximize hypertrophy, A recent Schoenfeld meta-analysis showed that basically from 1 to 10 sets, there was a continual increase along that spectrum, but it didn't seem to be plateauing past 10 sets per week. It's just that there weren't enough studies that went past 10 sets per week to be confident in what happened. So I would kind of assume it's somewhere between 10-ish and 20-ish for the most part for most people. But excessive volume can also be detrimental. Like the German volume training study that we reviewed in the free issue of Mass. So there will be a sweet spot. I think for most people, it's somewhere between 10 to 20-ish sets per muscle per week. But that's going to vary a lot person to person, possibly based on genetics, definitely based on training age, and probably based to some degree on exercise selection as well. So for example, if you compare, say, RDLs to hamstring curls, both of them are going to train your hamstrings really, really well, but you're going to take your hamstrings through much longer muscle lengths with the RDLs. So they're going to cause more muscle damage. They're going to be more inherently fatiguing. So they're definitely still a good exercise, but you won't be able to handle as many sets per week for hamstrings if it's more like hinge dominant work versus like hamstring curl dominant work. So there are definitely a lot of things that factor in, but I would assume for most people, it's kind of averages out to around 10 to 20 sets per week.
Greg, can I parallel off that?
Go for it.
I would also say it's important to understand what a meta-analysis is telling you. It's telling you, an average response across a ton of people. It's a big kind of like sledgehammer against the wall versus the fine detail work. So it also doesn't tell you how you should always train. We also have from meta-analysis back in 2004, I believe, from Ray, that periodized programs tend to produce better power and strength adaptations than non-periodized. So this would imply you don't just figure out what quote-unquote optimal is per week and then do it every single week. That some kind of planned variation and systematic approach to increasing volume over time and increasing strength over time should take place, rather than just going, I found a meta-analysis, this is how many sets I should do, this is the intensity, and I train like that every single week. Would probably be inferior to a more systematic approach and gradually building volume over time, taking planned tapers so that you can peak performance or just recover if you're kind of chasing a little bit too much. So I think, remember that you have to ask the right question to get a useful answer. And how many sets per week should I do it's a constantly moving target, and a meta-analysis cannot answer that question for you. The way as a coach that I use a meta-analysis would be, all right, so I have the basic structure of where I want to start someone, and I think about where they've been, where they want to go, their training age, all those things, what they've responded to in the past, and we start there, and then it's a constant adjustment over time. And that's what you have to do with yourself to be effective.
Yeah, just as Eric said and Greg said, I agree wholeheartedly with both of the responses. And the pre-recorded video that I did tonight, I started with two words, conceptual and integration. And what Eric just hit on there was conceptualize. And if you can conceptualize the meta-analysis and understand that, for greater training status, a little bit more volume is going to be better. And like we talked about in the German volume training study in issue 1, for a lower or moderate training status, a higher volume isn't going to be as good. And understand where that relates to you. But to be able to say, hey, this person should do exactly 8 sets per week on this, that's impossible to say without knowing everything about that person. And even if I know all the information, I can't even make that judgment until they train and we see how they recover. So the question is, also when you're structuring or disseminating that volume throughout the week, if your goal is to get a training frequency of 2 to 3 times a week, and then you train on Monday, and then you go back into the gym on Wednesday and you can't move, well, then you also pack too much volume into one day, because it's not about volume in a day or even volume in a week. It's about volume over time, and it's about how you disseminate that volume. And that's where a lot of other things come into play too, where we talked about RPEs and staying shorter of failure, so you're not creating as much damage so you can recover. So if you take person 1 and they go in the gym and do 10 sets of 10 on Monday, on let's say 70% on squat, it's game over for them. They're not coming back into squat again until, it's game over. They didn't save it. They got regular NES, and they just couldn't save the game. It didn't work out. And then on next Monday they came back in. It'd be a week before they squatted again. But if somebody did, let's say, 4 sets of 8 and kept it to a 6 to 8 RPE, and then came back and did something similar for a little bit less reps on Wednesday and something similar for a little bit less reps on Friday, they might have got less volume in one day, but similar volume throughout the week, or maybe a little bit more volume throughout the week, and that's going to be a better approach over time. So it's about how to disseminate volume and how to structure it. The other thing about the research is remember, the meta-analysis can only view what's done in the research, and the training status in the research is not as high as a lot of what we're looking at in the practical realm. So certain volumes and intensities haven't necessarily been done all the time. So all a meta-analysis does is look at what's been done in the scientific literature. It doesn't mean you haven't done something that's past that in your own training, right? But the meta-analysis can't evaluate that. So understand research and meta-analyses from a conceptual perspective. If you understand it from a conceptual perspective, then you can understand that you don't replicate exactly what's done there, but you take the concept and you apply it to yourself.
Yeah, so the concept there would be that there does seem to be, to a point, a relationship of increasing hypertrophy as you do more volume. That's the most important takeaway. Because if you take what Mike just said and you think, okay, what if we did a meta-analysis of just studies where you train each muscle group once per week? You probably have a lower threshold for number of sets if you compared that to a meta-analysis of just studies where you train it twice per week because of better dissemination and organization, right? So only so much you can know.
Yeah, and as Ali just said, and then I'll move on here, but Ali just said incredible stuff. Disseminating volume is something that I've not heard before. Great point. And that's something that all three of us just hit on. And I think it's a really such a paramount point because we've heard so much volume over the past few years in this industry. And while that's important, it's really about disseminating it that's even more important, because if it was all about volume, then we'd all go into the gym every day and just do as much volume as we can until we fell over. But that's certainly not the case. There's obviously not only a point of diminishing returns, but there's a point where you just simply can't recover, and it inhibits you from training again, and then it inhibits your training frequency. And if you inhibit your training frequency, you probably also inhibit your training volume. So I think it's a necessary point to discuss.
Absolutely. All right, next question. If I were to replace hypertrophy with strength, how much of what I said in my lecture would have changed? Assuming quite a bit, given that the dominant factor is specificity for determining outcome, strength gains specifically. Yeah, so I mean, so the question is about basically like what training variable is primarily driving strength gains, I believe. And in the short term, absolutely training intensity. So basically, let's say you have 4 to 6 weeks or so, and you want someone to hit the highest 1 rep max possible after 4 to 6 weeks. You're probably going to want them training pretty heavy most of the time. So at least touching, at least 80, 85% plus 1 rep max every week to get them really comfortable and efficient handling those loads to peak them out after 4 to 6 weeks. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the best thing for strength gains long-term all the time. So for example, muscle mass is going to be a very, very strong determinant of strength in well-trained lifters specifically. A study by Brachua and Abe in 2002 found that fat-free mass per centimeter of height the R squared between that and strength of squat, bench, and deadlift was anywhere between like 0.75 to 0.9, which means that like just how jacked the lifters were could predict or could explain like 75 to 90% of the variation in total strength.
In elite powerlifters.
So
yes.
in elite powerlifters, yeah. So yeah, in that case, if you're looking at long-term training, maybe training intensity for at least like parts of your training isn't going to be the primary driver. So in the off season, if you can accumulate more volume to build more muscle in the 70, 75, 80% 1 rep max range, that might be a smarter place to get the vast majority of your training in the off season. And then, 4, 6, 8 weeks out from a meet, start ramping up training intensity to peak and get ready to go on meet day. So yes, in the short term, training intensity and specificity is definitely the strongest predictor of strength gains. Long term, a ton of other things come into play.
Eric, do you want to jump in next? I'm sure you'll have something to add there.
Honestly, I think you covered it pretty well, to be honest.
Cool. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, I agree. I agree as well. I jotted down just a few things, but Greg said it really well. One thing to hit on too is, most studies are short term. So most studies are only 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks. Anybody else here that's conducting research knows that when you do a study, you're mostly doing it on college students. And then what happens? In America, they have Thanksgiving break, there's Christmas break, there's spring break, because all you college kids need spring break. Oh my God, you work so hard. And so you guys can't stay around And so studies 8, 10, 12 weeks. So it's hard to, a lot of after that, when we talk about a yearly macro cycle, it's all based on concepts, right? There's very few studies looking over a long term, a year, 2 years, 3 years, looking at that over time. So most studies are short term. So like Greg said, if somebody wanted to get their 1RM the highest they could possibly be in just 30 days and that's all they had to train, intensity is overwhelmingly a driving factor that they need to do. However, the other questions remain in the long term, the relationship between muscle growth and strength. How long is training at a super high intensity sustainable, not only from a neuromuscular perspective, but is the person going to continue to enjoy it? Are they going to adhere to the training? If you think of, I don't know, let's take a shape, a pyramid, adherence might be at the bottom of the pyramid. So all of those other factors come into play. So in the short term, and studies are short term, intensity is the driving factor. However, we have to look at things over the long term, and that's really where you see the utility of something like periodization, and you look at hypertrophy type phases to then help with strength gains and power gains later on.
Okay.
Word.
Okay. Mislav, what about the until failure component? If person A can do 10 reps to failure, would hypertrophy be the same or similar with 2 sets of 5 reps at the same load? Do you want to take this one, Eric?
Yeah, I would say that Greg pretty much covered that pretty well in his. So most research is done on taking sets to failure, and that is actually a big weakness of the research. Actually, someone commented in the thing that the effective volume is something we actually need to study. It's so hard to quantify what is effective volume. So yeah, like at what point does a set of 10 are you actually getting an effective training stimulus? It's tough to say, if that set of 10 is taken to failure. But from what here's the thing to realize is that basically the heavier a load and the fewer reps you're doing, assuming we're all going to failure, the longer that set's going to take on a per rep basis because it's harder to overcome its inertia, right? So the first rep on a set of 5 is typically going to be slower than the first rep on a set of 10. And you can look at this with a measure we call impulse in science, which is basically like if someone was standing on a force plate, which measures the actual force output someone's using, you kind of see this trace of what it is. An impulse is the area under the curve. So it won't go as high with lower loads, but you can do more reps, and it can go higher with higher loads. And you're probably going to get a similar impulse for a lot of different moderate to heavy rep ranges. And that's probably why, for the most part, the research that Greg looked at shows that when you're between, I'd say safely, 5 reps or higher, you could probably just match sets and get a similar response in terms of hypertrophy. That is hypertrophy, though. Obviously, if you're training for strength, there's that neuromuscular component we were talking about. And then it's not just whether you're going to failure or not, but also if you're using high enough loads to get those adaptations.
All right. Eric, can you talk a bit more about flexible dieting and its relationship to the dieting approaches you spoke about? Or is that just too broad of a question?
Eric, what do you got, man?
Oh, I think he froze.
Okay. Do you want to, let's save this one for Eric. Greg, you want to go to the next training question? And then we'll come back to that?
Yeah, for sure.
Michael, we're going to come back to your question, man. Don't worry. We want to get Eric to answer that since he's the most equipped to answer the dieting questions.
Okay. Okay. Thoughts on increasing volume via increase in sets versus a linear periodized approach within a mesocycle for hypertrophy.
Okay.
Do you want to take this one?
Sure, I'll start off and then we can both chime in. So increasing volume via increase in sets versus a linear approach within a mesocycle for hypertrophy. So let's just take, so if we have a linear periodized approach, so for hypertrophy, so in a linear program, you're going to have, let's say, every 6 weeks or so is when you're going to really be changing phases from, let's say, an 8 to 12 repetition range or going down from 12 reps to 10 reps, something like that. So I think over this time, you can certainly gradually increase sets, let's say. But what I would do is I would break, let's say, if you're in a linear periodized program, a 6-week block, I would break it into 2-week microcycles. One of the biggest misconceptions of a linear program is that there is no room for microcycle variation, but there certainly is. So let's say you have a 6-week block and then you have those first 2 weeks. Those first 2 weeks, you might be doing something like, let's say, 3 sets of 12. Well, then the next 2 weeks, you can do something like 4 sets of 10. and the next 2 weeks something like 5 sets of 8. And if you're doing that 2 times a week, let's say in a linear periodized program. So I would increase those sets, but the repetitions can still decrease. So you have 2-week microcycles in a linear mesocycle. So that's one of the big misconceptions when you think of a strict linear periodization program, is that there's no room for microcycle variation. I would say the bigger question is, though, and one thing we'll talk about in mass here quite a bit, is probably our integrated strategy of periodization. People misconstrue all the time. They think of things like DUP, linear periodization, block periodization, all of these as mutually exclusive concepts, and they're not. In reality, every macrocycle is going to decrease volume gradually over time and increase intensity over time. So it doesn't mean you can't alter repetitions within a week. Weekly changes are programming changes. Long-term changes are periodized changes. So if volume is here at the beginning of a macrocycle and here at the end, it might not go down gradually. It might go in this wave pattern up and down over time. Those are programming changes over the periodization changes over time. So in the strict sense of the linear program, I would just look at 2-week microcycles where you increase sets every 2 weeks and then you can gradually decrease reps. But in the bigger picture, I would look at incorporating blocks, volume blocks, with programming strategies in the week where you're altering reps into an overall linear cycle. And I think you can really integrate periodization strategies, which in my opinion would be a better way to approach it. And then all of the autoregulation strategies can be put into that. But in the strict sense of your question, I would just do 2-week microcycles where you can increase sets and decrease the repetitions that you're using, which would probably allow you to increase load over that linear mesocycle.
All right. But before we get into this next question, I just want to pause for a second to say, thank you a ton to everyone. We had about 450 people on here, and 160 of you have bought mass already, which is awesome. Wow. That's more, that's definitely a bigger response than we could have hoped for. So thank you so much, guys. I don't think humbled. We're honored. We're just absolutely blown away by your response, and we're really excited about everything we have planned on going. So we've already finished up the May issue that you're gonna get on May 1st. That's when it's dropping. We have a ton of really cool stuff in there, and you guys are gonna get an additional bonus issue along with that. But we're also already picking out articles for the June issue, which honestly, I'm the type of person who's always looking ahead to the next thing. So May issue isn't even out, and I'm already super stoked about June. So one of the studies I'm going to be reviewing for the June issue is looking at integrating conditioning for strength athletes, and whether it's better to do traditional high intensity intervals along with your strength training versus quote unquote lifting weights faster. So kind of like a CrossFit style WOD type thing, and which one is better for strength development and also aerobic development. So it's a super cool paper, and I'm excited to dig into that. So yeah, tons of cool stuff this month and also in the future. What do you want to talk about? A couple that you're reviewing, Mike?
Yeah, just quickly.
Am I back yet?
Unfortunately, you're back, Eric. We were celebrating, and then you just really everything cool you just ruined.
Oh my God! It looks like the webinar's dropped down only 5 people after I left.
Yeah.
Can we get them all back? Because everyone
nobody believes that. Nobody believes you. In terms of what I'm reviewing, actually, there's a question from Mark here. What are some guidelines for assessing recovery? Is it enough to just review performance? We can take that question on here in a little bit, but what I would say to that is stay tuned for the June issue. Greg and I were just chatting earlier today about articles for that, and one of them very likely will have to do with recovery. So it's definitely something we're going to get to as we come out and talking about things, and not just strategies. We talk about the overarching strategies of periodization and autoregulation, but within that, there's things like rest pause and cluster sets that can work in there. So those are all programming strategies. They're not overarching strategies where you say, hey, I just do rest pause training all the time. But it's where does rest pause training, where does cluster set training, where does circuit type training fit into a periodized construct? And there's so much more than just mentioning types of programming or strategies or types of periodization. So that's what we really want to get into, which is to stop leaving everybody guessing about all of these things and to say, hey, within this construct, where do we put this? So that's when we think about things conceptually. And I just kind of laid out for you a minute when we were having the best time of the webinar when Eric was off, when we were talking about the integrated periodization macro cycle. And I kind of laid that out for you guys a little bit. So what we want to start doing is answering some questions to tie all these programming strategies. Where do they fit within this macro cycle, right? Where do they fit over time? So that's what we're going to start to do in the June issue a little bit. And just like we said in issue 1, always think conceptually and always think about integrating concepts together. And that's what I want to get across here in mass, more so than somebody thinking, hey, this type of programming is the magic end-all be-all. No, things can be conceptualized together, and then when to utilize them is what we have to figure out.
Okay, let's get back into some of these questions. So from Kin, how do you feel about using Prilepin's table as a way to regulate training volume as opposed to the RPE system?
It's pronounced Prilepin.
It's pronounced what?
I'm just kidding. Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. Okay, so I can take this one. So Prilepin's table, I think if you follow it, you're gonna do okay. I mean, it's going to put you in a decent like volume and intensity range for the most part. The issue with it is I feel like people treat it as if it's like this like holy grail Bible to get strong and jacked, and they don't really think about how it actually came to be. So it was just based on like survey data from Russian weightlifters in leading up to the 1984 Olympics, I believe, and basically just asking them, how did you train to get ready? And then publish the data, and that's it. So no sort of analysis to see what worked better or worse. And keep in mind, this was like snatch, clean, and jerk. This wasn't all the training they were doing. And so I would assume volume and intensity requirements are probably a little bit different for power-based exercises like snatch, clean, and jerk than for squat, bench, deadlift. And also, this is the 1980s. There's no drug testing in the Olympics yet. So they very well may have had some chemical assistance that you and I aren't partaking in.
I don't believe that.
So put all of that together, and it's, like I said initially, it will put you in the right general range. It'll definitely point you in the right direction, but there are definitely better things out there. And if you're using Prilepin's table versus the RPE system integrated into a periodized training program, I think you're probably going to be better off with the latter.
Can I dovetail off that a little bit?
I just want to tell Dallas I love him too, and I don't have an IG, but I love you too, man.
Thank you for that, Mike. Yeah. So I actually was at the NSCA conference last year, and there was a poster abstract on a group that used the Prilepin's chart to guide their training. They didn't compare it to anything, but basically they went, yes, it works. So it's reasonable. But it's interesting you asked about the RPE system, because if you look at Prilepin's chart, you can tell that they're basically giving you reps associated with a certain intensity to avoid hitting failure. It's also important to remember that Olympic lifters, there's a huge skill component there. So they're not, they want to avoid missing lifts for the most part. So trying to ingrain those patterns. So it's funny that I feel like Prilepin's chart amazingly gets more press and attention among powerlifters than it even does among Olympic lifters. But I just don't know how applicable it is. But the concept there that, hey, you want to be able to use a load where you can still ingrain good form is useful. So that's one takeaway I would suggest from Prilepin's chart.
Yeah, just to add on to that, like Eric said, by the way, I'm reading all the comments here. I can't respond to all of them, but I'm enjoying them very much. Like Eric said, Prilepin's table is designed so that you're able to avoid failure, right? Because if you look at it, the amount of repetitions at a certain intensity it calls for is very conservative. So you're not really going to run into the failure issue a lot. But RPE is better. RPE individualizes that. Since we know rate of adaptation is individual, we also know the amount of repetitions allowed is individual. In our lab, unpublished data that we have that we're working on writing up, we found a range from about 10 to 26 repetitions that individuals could do on the squat at 70% one rep. Now, 26 was an outlier. But if we can think from like 10 to 20 on 70% on the squat for one set to failure, that's a huge range, right? So if you just take something like Prilepin's table, and it's not knocking Prilepin's table. I think there's a lot of merit and it's solid and it's going to be a decent base for somebody. But I think RP individualizes such more since there's a lot of individual variation of repetitions allowed. RPE allows you to do that, and allows you to kind of equate intensity, not in terms of percentage of 1RM intensity, but intensity in terms of the effort per set, if you will, and how many repetitions in reserve individuals have across the board. Skippy peanut butter is terrible. You get Jif, Marcus. Skippy shouldn't.
Just out of nowhere, middle of the sentence.
Well, hold on. This is important stuff now. I mean, we can talk about this is fine, but Skippy peanut butter is terrible. Also, chunky peanut butter is terrible. You get creamy peanut butter, because if I wanted peanuts, I would just buy them. That's why I wouldn't get chunky peanut butter. Jif is way. Thank you, Shiva. Shiva lives in Florida. Shiva knows. Likely it's chicken tender subs as well. We can move on now, but just important stuff. I get worked up over the important things going on.
Just to back up something Mike was saying as well.
You also
I'm putting an image here in the chat now. It's from a study by Tursis, 2012, just showing the massive range in the number of reps people can do with a given percent of 1 rep max. So Mike has unpublished data, and there's also published data on this showing that like even with a given intensity, there is a huge range, and RPE lets you like individualize that better.
Oh, there's also another one that I cite a lot where they compared, and so individual differences. These are all within, like Mike's lab, it's interesting. That's a huge range in resistance trained individuals. But then when you start to talk about different sports, there's a study on power athletes versus endurance athletes, and the difference is crazy.
Yeah.
Wasn't it an average of like 41 reps for the endurance athletes or something?
It was something stupid. They did basically from 80%, even 80%, there were big differences. But it wasn't until they got to 90% of 1RM that they were not statistically different. But if you look at the averages, the ranges are still kind of different at 90%. I think it was a leg press too. But
yeah, it's a great point. Yeah. Even in our lab, we're looking at the normal resistance trained college age individuals. So if there's a range among them, imagine what it's a range like against somebody else. Or if you get somebody that's typically training for bodybuilding most of the time, and they're much better at muscular endurance, and then if you just look at throughout a week. If we go back to saying, let's say, hey, somebody's training 3 times a week, doing 8 reps on Monday, 6 reps on Wednesday, and 4 reps on Friday. And let's say you want to progress from week 1 to week 2, and your goal is to just progress based upon RPE. Well, if somebody's a bodybuilder, they're usually training with high reps, and now they're trying to start training with lower repetitions. On the 8-rep day, if you program that with 70%, their RPE might be 4 or 5. But on the 4-rep day with 80 or 85%, their RPE might be 9 because they're not as good at that. So what I like to do in that case is from week 1 to 2, I progress the days differentially. I might progress the day they had an average RP of 5 by 7.5 kilos, and progress the day they had an average RP of 9 by nothing. Keep it the same. That way RP should normalize. So I know it's a little bit outside the box, but in terms of progression, if you have multiple training days with multiple repetition schemes throughout the week, and if you're using that type of programming strategy, you can alter them differently based upon RPEs, because individuals are certainly going to be, just because somebody's good at repetitions with 70% doesn't mean they're going to be good at repetitions with 90% either. So the range is huge, and that's why somebody asked the question earlier about individualization among programming. That's why everything is a concept, but everything has to be individualized. And remember, when you're looking at the results of studies too, you're only looking at means. So for the most part, you're looking at means. So there's just so many more things to go and look at here. But no, I agree wholeheartedly.
On that topic of individualization, that's something that I think we don't emphasize. We don't emphasize enough in literature. I think other fields get this a little better than we do. Like if you're a surgeon, for example, and you're staying, with evidence-based practice, and you're reading studies. If you have a specific surgery to do, you're actually going to read a lot of case studies that have been done with that surgery, in addition to RCTs, because you want to see similar conditions. So, for example, in the May issue, I talk a fair bit about a lot of the case studies that have been done on natural bodybuilders, because I think sometimes when you're dealing with a very specific population under very specific conditions, there are things you can learn from a case study that you can't learn from those big RCTs. And that's something that, because mass is about practical application, we try to emphasize individual differences, and we don't just cover like a meta-analysis. We also cover case studies in the in the 9 issues we do a month. So I think that's something that, especially if you are a coach, you need to think about, is that the studies only report means, and that your individual clients are basically N of 1 case studies that you need to consider. So anyway.
And just in talking about means and things like that, one thing that we're going to do in mass is really not only give you the take-home message from studies, but evaluate studies in terms of the rigor of the statistical analysis that they did. Did they report individual subject data and things like that? So I think from us, we're going to try to be able to, if a study does that, we're going to point that out for you guys and try to give a little bit more information on some of those things.
Yeah. So one example just of that that's coming out in the May issue, and this was pretty striking because it was an issue like right there in the title of the paper. It was comparing benching with straight weight to benching with bands. And the title of the paper was something to the effect of variable resistance training promotes greater strength and power adaptations. It's like promotes greater strength adaptations is in the title of the paper. But when you actually like look through the results, the group benching with bands put like 5.1% on their bench, and the group benching with straight weight, it was like 4.8 or 4.7 or something like that. And like when you actually calculate a between group effect size, it was essentially 0. But basically the way the authors did the stats was kind of jacked up. So there were definitely some cool, like legit findings from that study with regards to velocity and power output and the difference between the two groups. But the finding for strength, if you just read the abstract, or if you just read what was reported in the study, but didn't actually take the time to look deeper into the statistics, you could conceivably get hoodwinked by poor statistical methods.
Excellent use of hoodwink. Yeah, that's good.
That's good.
Or even bamboozled.
Or bamboozled, yes.
There'll be a vocabulary test at the end of the webinar.
So yeah, I think that's definitely one thing we do with mass that's better than you're going to see a lot of other places. Because I think a lot of people kind of assume that statistics are boring and no one cares about statistics, but they're really important. And as long as you can contextualize them and make them relevant to people, that's kind of the bedrock of science, like understanding the stats that are being done. One other benefit with mass, and I think you guys are kind of picking up on this by now, like getting to chill out with us three bros after the webinar, is like the stuff we're talking about is stuff that's very useful and relevant to you. So, it's not like let's say you subscribe to some journal. It's probably going to run you $300-400 a year just to subscribe to one, and probably a solid 2/3 to 3/4 of every issue is probably going to be stuff you don't really care about. So with mass, it's cheaper than subscribing to most individual journals, and we're going through 50 to 60 per month, pulling out the stuff that's going to be the most useful and relevant to you, and making sure you can keep up with the research that way, in a way that's efficient and cost effective, without like belaboring a ton of research, which might be interesting to the three of us just on an academic level, but probably isn't going to be all that useful and beneficial for your day-to-day training.
Marcus hit the nail on the head there. Hey, we want to go to the next question, guys?
Sure. All right, Jose. Given the set count recommendation for volume, what is the metric for progressive overload? Just more sets? Seems we need to add another variable, perhaps average load per set. Yeah, so, progressive overload can be accomplished in a variety of ways. The two biggest ones that most people would pay attention to would be volume and intensity. And so if you're using number of sets as your main metric of volume, then yeah, that's how you would progress volume. But you can also accomplish progressive overload still by increasing intensity per week. Or even, and this is something that people don't, I think, pay attention to enough, especially for hypertrophy, is figuring out ways to increase range of motion and generally making exercises more difficult. So range of motion seems to be one of the big drivers of hypertrophy as well. So yeah, there's definitely other ways to achieve progressive overload other than just increasing volume. But if you are using number of sets per week as your main variable to track volume, then yeah, if you were trying to increase volume, that's primarily what you would do.
If I can just chime in there too, I think that I agree with Greg's response. And one of the things I would add is that we get too fixated on thinking we have to have some sort of progressive overload every single week. And that's just completely unrealistic. if we were all able to add 2.5 kilos every week or add a set every week, then, we'd all be as strong as Greg, or we'd all be as strong as Mike Teixeira. But you're not Greg and you're not Mike Teixeira. Sorry to tell you that, or most likely you're not. So we get very fixated on, hey, we have to add 2.5 kilos to the squat each week. Even on an assistance exercise, if you're doing a barbell curl and you're going to say, hey, I'm going to a 2.5 kilo change in a barbell curl, that's a huge percentage of the amount of weight that you're lifting. So to be able to think that you're going to do that is completely unrealistic. So maybe you're doing sets of 10, and maybe on that last set you add just a repetition. Not that that's going to make a huge difference in progressive overload, but maybe mentally it's a little bit of progress for you, and you can use that then to progress in the following week. So if you're looking at progressing volume, let's say you're a bodybuilder and you're doing 3 volume blocks for every 1 intensity block. So let's say we think of those 4 blocks, 3 volume and 1 intensity. Well, after you do those 3 volume and 1 intensity, when you go back to your next volume block, maybe your goal is to have slightly higher relative volume in that 5th block, which is now your first volume block of that second macro cycle, if you will, than you did during that first volume block. So maybe it's over time progression that I would be more concerned with. And the same thing for a powerlifter in terms of increasing load. You're not going to be able to do that every single week. And that's also the utility of autoregulation. If you can't as well, you can keep within an RPE range. But the gradual progress over time, if every 6 months down the road, you can see you're making some substantial progress in terms of volume load or in terms of intensity, that's a great thing. But I find if you try to do that every single week, it might be your goal to do it every single week, but understand that you can't, and don't force it if it's not there. That's when we get into trouble. That's when you just really disastrous things happen. If you have to taper a block, too early, you end up becoming injured. You end up just really becoming into kind of an overreaching stage that you can't recover from. So don't be so fixated on progressing in terms of overload each week. That's going to happen over time.
I agree. I pinned a really good question that I didn't want to lose from Eli. You want to move on to that, or are we good?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, so Eli asked, as evidence-based advocates, how do you respond to people who deny the conclusions by saying for every study there's a study showing the opposite, or it works differently in my experience with my trainees? I think it's really important, if you want to be an evidence-based practitioner, or if you want to use the science in what you're doing, to understand the way science works, especially in our field where we have low sample sizes. Just by statistical chance, you're going to see false conclusions get published in our field. So it is much more important to look at the totality of evidence rather than to find one study that fits your bias, because you will always be able to find a study that fits your bias. And the confidence you have in your conclusions need to be related to how high in the evidence hierarchy you're looking at data. Like if you've got a well done, Cochrane, standard meta-analysis that has a good inclusion and exclusion criteria, and it has, strong findings, you can be pretty confident that's going to stand the test of time. And that's what we're looking at with some of the meta-analyses we've been talked about. We're also the same findings by Peterson or Krieger back in the day, 8 years ago or even 10 years ago. And that likely will still be the case. I don't think we're going to overturn the volume hypertrophy relationship, for example. So yeah, for every study, there might be a study showing the opposite, or at least you can find one. But if you find 7 studies and 5 are showing one outcome, you should have a reasonable amount of confidence that that's probably the correct way it goes. And then for the last second part of that question, it works differently in my experience with my trainees. Well, that's not invalid. Your anecdotal experience is still valid experience. And again, I think it's important to realize that as a coach, and who you decide to work with and who you take on, you're going to be selecting. That's not a random sample. So for example, with 3D muscle training, we put out our information and we know we're going to get drug-free, holistically minded, online bodybuilders who spend a lot of time on the internet, right? That is going to have an impact on how they respond. So when I think about what has been successful with my athletes, I don't think that's what works in general. I have to take into consideration that I'm not using a random sample and that my findings may be specific to the type of people who I attract or who I work well with, So you have to put science in the appropriate context and anecdote in the appropriate context, and then figure out, how they apply to any given situation.
And then something else, like this is really basic, but I see people misinterpret this all the time. Generally, what you're looking at in a study is which of 2 interventions did better, not which intervention worked and which one didn't. So a lot of times when people are saying, oh, well, this study said that A is better than B, but I do B with my clients and they get good results. Oftentimes the study's not saying that B didn't work. It was just saying that A worked better than B. So that I see that a lot.
So you didn't do A and B with your client. You just did B anyway. So,
yeah, exactly. And then also, like, a lot of people don't collect good data on their clients. So they kind of have like a selection bias. Like when they remember, like they'll think back to their clients that had really, really good results and not really remember all that many of their bad clients or average clients. So one of the benefits of science is everyone's there. Like unless someone drops out of a study, like you have their measurements pre and post. So that goes a long way to helping people control for bias. So yeah, it could be that in that example, someone put their top responding genetic freak client on protocol B, whatever protocol B was, and that person had gangbuster results. But maybe if they compared enough of their clients on both of those programs, it wouldn't be all that dissimilar to what the science was saying.
Yeah, just quickly, I agree wholeheartedly with that. I would also say that, so many people don't necessarily understand how to read and interpret research, that they're maybe making conclusions that what they're seeing wasn't supported by research, but it might very well be. The underlying physiology, may be very similar to what they're seeing. Lastly, I'd also say there's also different levels of anecdotes. I think Eric and I have spoken about this before as well. So, some random dude has no idea about anything, controls for no variables and says, hey, I noticed, I took this supplement this month and, my bench press went up 20 pounds. Immediately, he mentioned supplements, so that he's saying things that don't make sense. But that's not a good anecdote. But if somebody like Greg says, hey, from my hundreds of clients that I've changed or that I've trained and from my own training, I haven't necessarily seen this in the literature yet. But when I do this with my programming, I notice some really good adaptations. It doesn't mean that he's right, but it does mean it's a really good anecdote considering the source. And sometimes anecdotes can even drive training. A lot of stuff that Eric and I have discussed, and I know I've discussed with other people, have impacted.
Drive science?
Did I say training? It can drive science, it can drive studies. A lot of stuff that Eric and I have discussed have been incorporated into our studies, and we've utilized that to answer some questions. So I think that can work as well. Hey, guys, I wanted to say real quick, there's a comment on here. I want to find it back again. Somebody wanted to get back. A couple of people commented to get back to the nutrition question that we were going to answer when Eric got cut off. I don't know if we can find that, but I felt badly because I know a few people wanted that to get answered, and we were answering it. And then, Eric, when you cut off, we moved on to training because we wanted to save that for you.
So it was the general question about flexible dieting,
I believe so. I didn't mean to hijack us here, but I know people wanted us to get back to that.
Sure. I will address that in general. I think for the most part, and I've even seen this, and I actually made a video on this that's going to come out soon. People will even type flexible dieting / if it fits your macros. And that actually grinds my gears a fair bit because flexible dieting is a type of attitude towards food and dieting. That is seeing things as not being isolated to the food or the day or being on or off the diet. It's rooted in whether or not you have a black and white or dichotomous view of eating. It's not actually the approach you take. You could have a flexible dieter who is on a meal plan, and maybe they realize that they can swap out the apple for the banana. Oh God, right? Likewise, you can have someone with a very rigid mindset on 3 macros, and those macros are on this godlike pedestal. And if they're supposed to have 300 grams of carbs next and they have 305, the world's over and they eat a pizza. I've seen that all the time. So flexible dieting is not a specific strategy, rather it's an attitude. And in bodybuilders and in people who are typically rather rigid inherently, what you need to do is create structure that has continuums and ranges versus yes or no binary based options. So for example, you might have 3 macros. However, you would have a plus or minus 10 gram range on each of them. And if you accidentally overshoot one of those, then you shift down to, I'm going to hit my protein target and calories. And if you blow your protein target, then you just go calories. And if you go over your calories completely, then you can have a flex of plus or minus 20% on subsequent days. So you can institute a system so that it can allow you to have some kind of structured flexibility, which I talk a lot about in the free issue. And then I really go into the kind of the art of it and how to incorporate it in the first paid issue. So I would definitely want to check that out. It's part 2 of the flexible dieting series. I think it's like 40 minutes. I kind of went off. I probably should have kept it a little shorter, but it's very in depth. If you guys want to see that, I would encourage you to check out the mass.
Eric, I think Jan just clarified the question a little bit that got cut off. Not to give you too much, but I thought we should get back to that for them.
Sure. Your thoughts on maintenance phases, less often versus diet breaks. So Jan, the actual study on diet breaks, they used, I think, 2-week periods at maintenance. Now, I think that's perfectly useful. What I typically do in the context of a bodybuilder, because you are working with a deadline rather than just a overweight population who wants to make a lifestyle change, is I typically do a 1-week break for every 4 to 8 weeks. And I use that flexible range because sometimes life can just get very hard, or they're going great and you don't want to do it every month. You're like, let's not stop our momentum. Early on, I will typically institute the first week-long diet break once we start to hit a plateau. So we might get a full 3 months of dieting out of someone if they have a fair amount of fat to lose and they're maintaining a good activity level and we didn't start too aggressive. But I've seen a lot of, let's talk about anecdotes. I tend to I think I do a pretty good job of tracking data in clients. And I look back at a couple of years ago when I had slightly different methods to now, since I don't have 2 twins I'm working with. And I think I've gotten substantially better results for people getting on stage, healthier, saner, and leaner with more fullness, incorporating diet breaks. But it does require a longer diet and being more strategic and planning ahead of time.
I'm still here, man. I know Richard said we lost. I'm still here, dude. So I was looking off to the side. I'm writing notes down as we talk. But I didn't go anywhere.
Do you guys want to take this one? Something we disagree on?
I'm up for that.
Did we reconcile? Oh.
I'd be interested in something you disagree on. We can do that, man. Greg, let us know.
Shiva says Mike and Eric disagree on most things. Greg is too amicable to find out.
We agree on a lot of things outside of research, or disagree on a lot of things outside of research. That's for sure.
Yeah. Where do I start? I mean, God, this guy, he's such a bad influence on my students. He came over to visit, and all of a sudden I walk in the lab one day, and there are my students doing calf raises. And, I feel like they're going to put a mirror in the lab now. So they can.
That's how you're going to check your posing.
It's just terrible. It's the worst. So,
Mike, when are you going to put out the first RCT on posing?
So,
optimal presentation.
Yeah, I mean, my look.
Actually, can I take this question seriously? Because I think there's actually a use.
There's nothing serious to take about it. No. What could possibly be serious? Are you, Eric? Eric, you can't come over to my house and ask me if I want to have a pickup bodybuilding game again. It's weird. It's weird.
Whatever, just because you're used to your mainstream sports, It
means, yeah. In college, I played real sports. Sorry about that.
Yeah, college. Come on. But so on an interesting note, though, typically, Jose, the disagreements in between researchers, if they're well informed, happen at the edges of where we have good data. So, for example, we don't have that meta-analysis, or where there is only 1 or 2 studies, or we only have mechanistic data. That's where you tend to run into these disagreements. A great example would be in the 90s, and even into the mid-2000s, there was a lot of disagreements around the role of the growth hormone and testosterone response to resistance training, because it hadn't been truly directly compared, and all we had was correlational data. So we do disagree, probably, but it has more to do with the way we interpret limited research. And when you see, and honestly, some disagreements that you see out there are just people are uninformed, or it's not their area of specialty, and they are having a little bit of a Dunning-Kruger moment, and they don't realize that what they're talking about is something they haven't read all the research on. So I would say the learning point here, Jose, is that if you are following someone and they seem very confident and they're speaking hyperbolically and in absolutes, and it's not something that they're a specialist in, I would take that with a big grain of salt. Like if you ever hear me talking a whole lot about aerobic exercise and cardiovascular disease, and I'm super confident, I'm probably wrong just because I don't know anything about that. And a good researcher is aware of what they don't know, hopefully.
Yeah, just the one thing that Eric said right there, I think is, unfortunately, I'm going to have to agree with them, which is the worst. But is
I disagree.
Thank God. That means I'm probably right. That Eric said is, when somebody's going outside of the area, and that's really the one thing about mass is we're focusing on strength sport. We're focusing on what we do. Like our research laboratory, for example, we don't do a lot, but what we do, I think we do well. And we try to kind of stay within our lane for the most part. All kidding aside, when Eric got cut off and there was a question on dieting, Greg and I didn't answer, and we came back to that because I could have answered it, but it would have been terrible. It's not why you're here. You're not here. Hopefully nobody's here to hear me talk about nutrition. Right? You're here to hear Eric answer those questions. You're here to hear Eric answer those questions. So I think that's important, but I just think it drives home the point that we do agree on most things. And there are probably minor points of disagreement we have here or there, and I think we've all probably rubbed off on each other a little bit. And if we disagree with somebody else that's on something slightly, I would imagine that is very competent in one of these areas of strength sport. I would imagine it's actually a fairly minor disagreement. Once you begin to start to talk to people that are very competent in the area, and you see them, say things on the internet, and then you talk to them in person, or you correspond with them, you realize your disagreement is you're really very, very close together. If there's a 3x5 index card of opinion, you're both on that index card probably. So I think there are pretty minimal disagreements. I see the one question here about not mixing rep ranges. I don't know Mike's thoughts on that, but he's a super smart guy, man. So I would imagine that our disagreements aren't too much. That's another guy. He knows his stuff, man. So I would imagine we're all kind of in the same vicinity there. When we get to it, if somebody has the knowledge in that area and they're really an expert like he is, we're probably all very similar if we were to begin talking. That'd be my guess at least.
I think of because Mike Israel and I talk a fair amount, and we disagree on things
semi-publicly.
Yeah, semi-publicly, and most of the time it's on stuff that is kind of at the edge. Like right now, the role of muscle damage and hypertrophy is in dispute. So if we disagree on that, that's not like us disagreeing on, hey, there's a volume relationship with hypertrophy, or hey, having bigger muscles makes you stronger. Like that's stuff we pretty much disagree on, or hey, a calorie deficit results in weight loss.
But the overall structure of what you're talking about is similar. I talk to, not just to tell you how cool I am, but I talk to Mike Teixeira sometimes because I'm pretty cool. And when I do, like, we have points of disagreement here or there, but we learn from each other. But the overall structure of what we do is, we agree on those. And somebody says, hey, I'm going to sign up with Mike T for training instead of you. I said, that's a great decision. You're going to be in great hands, So it's, those are all points that I think, the overall structure, and most people that have expertise in the area, like the guys we just mentioned, are all pretty similar when you really start to talk about it.
Yeah, I would generally agree with that. I think, like, definitely the majority of the time that I've found myself disagreeing with someone who I generally respect in this field, like, you hit them up, and generally both people, like, when you actually talk through, like, hey, here's what you think, here's what I think, why do you think this, why do I think that? Generally, you come to a point pretty quickly that you realize that there's nothing like approaching definitive proof that either of you are right. So you can just kind of say, like, look, there's mechanistic research saying this, there's mechanistic research saying that. You think this is more compelling, I think that's more compelling. Hopefully someone will actually do the study and we'll find out.
Yeah. Great example would be, I don't know if anyone's aware of the kind of debate that went back and forth between me and Menno Henselmans, where he drew into question my master's research on the hypothesis that a higher protein intake might be more useful during a diet. And, we basically threw a bunch of studies at each other, and we pointed out all the issues with them. And, in the end, we said, there's not strong evidence either way. I think this is most likely because of this. I think it's most likely because of that. And, if we look at a study where, higher protein intake seemed to be better during an 8-week diet, and he goes, well, yeah, but that could have been protein timing. And I go, yeah, but I don't think protein timing matters that much. And he goes, well, how can you know? And I go, well, I can't. It's just what I think. That's not, neither is an unreasonable position, So.
And that's a great debate, and that's how you move things forward. And especially in this field, like, there are so many things that are open to interpretation. So you guys, neither one of you was necessarily wrong, and neither one of you is necessarily, going to be proven right in that, because you can't really be proven right. The other thing is, unfortunately, I tell my students when I lecture the classes every semester, I tell them, unfortunately, something that I'm telling you this semester is going to be shown to be wrong at some point. I don't know what it is. I don't think it's wrong now, or I wouldn't be telling it to you, but something will be shown to be wrong. And we've all been wrong at some point, and we all will be wrong again. And we have to be open to that idea. So I think that's another really thing that we have to understand with our field, is because we have small sample sizes in our studies, and because studies are short term, and we're talking about long term, periodization strategies and all of these things, we're extrapolating some data. We're making our educated, inference based upon the data that is there, and using all of the information we have at hand. But we are making things that are open to interpretation. We are doing that, and we're all doing that to an extent. And I'm sure if we were to sit here and talk enough, the three of us would interpret something when we you like that word?
I like interpret.
Yeah, well, a lot of Diet Mountain Dew today. Interpret something when we extrapolate it to the long term a little bit differently, and that's okay. And that's how we learn from each other. I know Eric and I have talked a lot over the last 4 years, and I'm sure we've probably rubbed off on each other a little bit in terms of what our training is. So I think that's something that's big in our field a lot, and I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, just if I can make a plug really quick, that is one of the things you'll get out of subscribing to Mass.
Really, you don't say.
Only $19.99 a month.
But if you act now, but no, I mean, there's things do change. Like Mike said, he tells his students, like, the stuff I'm telling you now is probably someone's going to show that at least a little bit of it is wrong before the end of the semester. Yeah. And there are a surprising number of things that a lot of people are very behind on. So, for example, one example which I was taught in undergrad just like a few years ago was that you can't have interconversion of fiber types between type 1 and type 2 fibers in the vast, vast majority of circumstances. So, like, if you have like major nerve damage, or if you're like when people get really, really old, they might have some type 1s convert to type 2s. But for healthy young people, you can have type 2A to type 2X interconversion, but not type 1 to type 2. But that's based on like older fiber typing methods. And the first study is actually proving that you can have interconversion between type 1 and type 2 fibers, or at least like changes in myosin isoform relative content within a single muscle fiber. That stuff's from like the mid 90s. Like the first studies like conclusively showing that happens. So most people, when they're learning stuff in undergrad, are how long ago is that? Like 20, almost 25 years behind the research for something like as
in fairness,
that's as much
Eric's
of a basic
undergrad was before that. Eric's undergrad was before that. So okay. I mean.
Eric went through undergrad before the first muscle biopsies were taken in the 1930s.
Hey, Eric, what was it like watching Babe Ruth play? Were you at those games?
I still think he was on roids, even though they didn't exist at the time. It's too strong.
But yeah, like there is absolutely enormous benefit to keeping up with the research, because something that basic, a lot, like I would say 80-90% of the industry is 25 plus years behind on it. So yeah, that's a lot of these like debates and squabbles will be resolved as more research comes out, but a lot of people aren't aware of the new research as it comes out in the first place.
While we're talking science, Greg, and muscle physiology, because it's what I do, in terms of another thing that's said all the time in undergrad class, a motor neuron is a muscle or a motor unit is a motor neuron in all of the fibers that it innervates. Well, it's always said that a motor neuron always innervates solely type 1 fibers or solely type 2 fibers. And it's very difficult to say that that's the case. And I think there's some recent evidence. We can't say it's not the case, but it's very difficult to say that definitively, that you only have these high threshold and low threshold motor units. And it's hard to say that. So I think a lot of times textbooks are behind the times. Whenever people ask me, hey, what textbook can I get to read on, strength training? It's hard for me to recommend a textbook. I don't use textbooks when I teach my classes, because I think by the time they're written, it's outdated. This is coming from a guy that just wrote a textbook chapter a few months ago. But nonetheless, But nonetheless, I think textbooks become outdated. So when somebody's asking on training, my usually recommendation to them is to read a basic anatomy and physiology textbook or an ex-phys textbook to get the underlying understanding of muscle physiology and adaptation, and even cardiovascular physiology if they're interested in that side of it. And then to look into the recent research for training. And if you understand how muscle adaptations occur, then training sets and reps and intensity, that's going to make much more sense when you understand the time course of myofiber damage and recovery and things like that, and how nuclei can be added via satellite cells to allow myofibers to grow. It's going to make much more sense how to program when you understand those underlying structures first. So whenever somebody say, hey, what textbook can I read on training? I would say get a basic ex-phys or anatomy and physiology textbook first, and then you can move forward when you look into that stuff.
Yeah, it's really important. It's unfortunate that I think a lot of undergrads programs will focus more on memorization rather than teaching you concepts, because I think you can't learn enough in a broad undergraduate degree to really fully understand some of the high-level concepts that are addressed in some of the literature. But what you can learn is generally how biology and everything works. And I think from there, then you want to launch from there. So that's one thing, is when you're thinking about who do I want to follow or who do I want to listen to or what information should I consume, you should be looking for people who can teach you how to critically think, which is something that, it's the whole, you hopefully will learn from seeing how we analyze research in mass. But anyway, I'm getting
basic science first and critical thinking skills first.
Word.
All right, guys, I think that's a good place to wrap things up. If we didn't get to your questions, we're really sorry, but we have to be off by 9 or the replay will screw up. So blame Webinar Jam, not us. But yeah, guys, thank you so much for attending. Everyone who's already bought Mass, thank you so much. If you haven't, screw you. Just kidding. You're also like legit awesome for sticking around to this point, because we'd probably be bored if we were you. But you have the patience of Job, apparently. But yeah, guys, thank you so much for coming. We're going to be in touch about more mass-related things over the next few days as launch progresses. Hope you guys got something out of the webinar itself and out of this Q&A. And yeah, we'll be in touch. Thank you so much again.
Thanks, you guys.
Really appreciate it.